Hello, everyone. This is Alan Gocho, your host of True Crime Man's Dark Imagination, and I'd like to welcome you to our third marathon. Of course, we have some sound effects in the background. It's storming here in Louisiana, so what's new? We did take the poll results that were conducted recently and came up with a whole new slew of suggestions based upon the episodes that we have done in the past. So for our third marathon, you will see these episodes. And now, let's show some appreciation to some subscribers, both old and new. Play Mobile in the News, Larry Kane, Eric Schneider, Amy is Fabulous, Kelly B. Ranyan, Moon Goddess, Cassidy Gant, Sandra Maureen Schott, Wendy Macy, Estrella Albaron, Prussian Eagle, Aubrey Stahl, True Crime, that's Troo, Crime, Greg Kittleson, Just Jelena, the Daily Proton Star Wars channel, Brittany Trombador, Ghost Killer 346, David Bartleman, Josh Finella, W.L. Newton, Jane Jarvis, Lizette Clark, Salvatore Musso, Sam Sipial, Serge Gar, Yvonne Wielgosh, hope I pronounced that correctly, Sandra Gaither, Darth Marak, Peto Banton, Tina Arco, Jean Francis, Eduardo Gemarillo, hope I got that one good, Donna Puckett, The Cold Poet, Taylor Wright, Tora Cube, Sam Mann, Violet Gosselin, What the French Toast, I know that's another YouTube true crime channel, Mitzi Carpenter, Matt Abear, Carries Down the Rabbit Hole, Loomis Show, Jabbles Fan 1, Victoria Benson, Adrian Tardy Gurdon, Maria Clara, Little Wolf 68, Catherine C. Rooney, Aslam Muhammad, Joey Viagra, what a name, Jabba J, Spirit Woman, A.D. Ray, Angel Purdy, Kelly Ellis, Junior Pena, Bolsheviki, Carolyn Shaw, Funky Tomo, Harry Pothead, that's original, Max Oliver Murray, and Burnt Reynolds. And now, without any further ado, we're going to present our episode, Marathon 3. On April 28, 1908, a middle-aged woman visited an attorney to write her last will and testament. A woman of substantial means, she stipulated within the document that should she pass, her children would inherit all of her possessions and holdings. If the children died, the estate would revert to the Norwegian Children's Home. The attorney looked at the woman and stated that he needed the official name of the orphanage in order to authorize the will. The middle-aged woman became frustrated and stated, "There's no time to wait." The attorney reluctantly signed the will, certifying it to a legal standing. The middle-aged woman seemed in a hurry to make sure that the document was official. What was the rush? For this woman, it was an act. It seemed that this once attractive matron felt that her life may be in danger. But later facts emerged that this was exactly the opposite. She was the danger, and anyone who crossed her path or witnessed her crimes met a certain fate. A fate that ended with a cold, dirt grave. Born Bella Pulsdatter in Trondheim, Norway, to a successful stonemason,
Bella had 2 brothers and a sister. The brothers followed in the family business, and when the sister was old enough to leave, she traveled to America on her own. Shortly after her arrival in the United States, Anna Pulstader married a man from Chicago named John Larson. Knowing that her sister Bella lacked any substantial skills to remain in her native land, Anna invited her sister to America to stay with the Larsons. Bella went to America in 1883 at the age of 24. Bella landed in the United States, and while in Chicago, where her sister and brother-in-law settled, Bella met a young security guard named Mads Sorensen. Immediately after the couple married, they tried to conceive children, but the venture proved unsuccessful. Instead, being in a stable financial position at the time, they adopted children from parents in their neighborhood who could not afford to raise those children. The Sorensens eventually adopted 3: Jenny, Myrtle, and Lucy. Although family life proved happy, the family had to keep moving due to frequent fires. Over the course of the Sorensen marriage, they had to move 3 times because fires engulfed their residences. Luckily, no one was hurt. Furthermore, the Sorensens owned a small grocery store in Chicago that did not see a profit until the building burned down. At the time, Bella Americanized her name to Belle, and neighbors remembered her as being a great wife to Mads and a doting mother who only raised her voice to scold the children. In early 1900, Mads suddenly became ill and subsequently died. His symptoms had been chest pains, and those occurred on the day of his death. The doctor then signed the death certificate with a heart attack being the cause. After Mads' death, Belle found herself with $8,000 in life insurance money, a large sum in those days. With this tragic windfall, Belle packed the children up and held her money close as the family moved to LaPorte, Indiana. When Belle and the children arrived, she contacted the local Norwegian community, a conclave that her dead husband mentioned to her several times, and he even had plans to retire there. Belle decided that the family would put down roots in the Indiana community and bought a farm not too far from the city limits. It turned out that the house she purchased once belonged to a local madam, and when she died, at a ripe old age, the property fell into disrepair. The house paralleled McClung Road and stood on the edge of a swamp to one side and an orchard on the other. The house stood 2 stories high and appeared made with red brick on the outside. When Belle and the girls moved in, they set about airing the house, which reeked of cheap perfume and cigars. Drawing the support of her neighbors, Belle realized that they disliked a house of ill repute in their neighborhood and appreciated Belle's willingness to bring the house back to a respectable fashion. The house contained 6 bedrooms, a large dining area, large bedrooms, a long kitchen, and a high-beam ceiling. Kerosene lamps adorned the hallways and the rooms, which seemed to provide more than enough light. Carpenters and craftsmen worked to bring the house to some sort of grandeur, again pleasing the neighbors. Almost as soon as Belle arrived in LaPorte, she had a new husband. Peter Gunnis, a nearby farmer and widower, brought with him an infant son from a previous marriage. His house was not too fancy, but he owned a lot of property. Almost as soon as the 2 moved in with Belle, the baby contracted a virus and died. The hard work entailed with keeping a farm running soothed the grief the family experienced. Neighbors often cited Belle and Peter in town, where they ventured occasionally to sell their meat and trade manure for other supplies needed for the farm. And then, one winter night before the end of 1902, one of the adopted daughters, Jenny, heard a loud crash and rushed downstairs to find her stepfather on the floor of the kitchen, bleeding profusely from a bad wound to his head. Belle, standing over her husband, became inconsolable as she related to her daughter that the big meat grinder they kept in the house fell from a shelf and struck Peter Gunnis in the head. He was dead by the next morning. Over the course of the next several years, Belle received many gentlemen to work on the farm in the hopes that they would turn into a marriage proposal. But soon after the men came to live on the farm and sampled the fruits that Belle was willing to supply, so to speak, they left her during the season when she needed them most, harvest time. Some rumors began to spread that the men did not exactly leave, but they had a habit of mysteriously disappearing. At the point when one of the farmhands became a suitor, he vanished without much of a trace, with Bell merely stating that he disappeared or ran off with another woman. One of these men, Peter Carlson, talked marriage with Bell, but then he was nowhere to be found a few weeks later. A young 19-year-old man, Emil Greening, often came to the farm to offer his services, but the young man's interests lay more with Jenny, Bell's teenage foster daughter, rather than with the much older, matronly Bell. When Jenny left for college in California, the young man appeared heartbroken and therefore never offered his services to Bell after that. In the spring of 1907, however, Bell approached a 30-year-old all-round maintenance man named Ray Lamphere. Lamphere took to working on Bell's land very quickly and made some money as he had an alcoholic addiction to support. Lamphere took up residence in a room on the second floor of Bell's house, but the relationship soon blossomed into a full-fledged affair. Bell and Lamphere were seen around the town arm in arm, and the young bachelor professed that she seduced him because she heard he was quite the man. Lamphere even sported a gold watch that Bell had given him to his drinking buddies whenever he stepped away from the farmstead. The affair between Lamphere and Bell did not last long, some of the townspeople surmised, because Bell was soon seen with another gentleman as the two went shopping for a wedding ring at Oberreich's department store. Lamphere appeared stunned when someone gave him the news. Lamphere, in several drunken rants, stated that females were no good, and he often stayed drunk for days. One day, when he learned that the new suitor who desired Bell's hand in marriage had suddenly disappeared, Lamphere felt some relief and thought of a way to get back into Bell's graces. But then she appeared with a new suitor no sooner had the previous one disappeared. Described as a large Swede, Andrew Helgelien, it seemed that Bell had finally found happiness and noticed that whenever Helgelien walked into town, there was a spring in his step and an air of glee, with Bell draped over the big Swede's arm. Helgelien went to a bank in South Dakota to withdraw funds so that he could return to LaPorte and marry Bell. He even said as much to the teller at the bank. Bell also informed Lamphere that he needed to find another residence as she was allowing Helgelien to stay in the spare room until the wedding. Lamphere did not respond well to the news and quit his employment with Bell, cursing her later that night at one of the local bars. A week had passed. Bell cried on a neighbor's shoulder that she never learned from her mistakes. Helgelien left her too, or at least that's what she told the neighbor. Bell asked Lamphere to return, but he refused, forcing the middle-aged woman to rely on a good worker named Joe Maxon. It appeared that Maxon never expressed a romantic or sexual interest in Bell, as on most evenings he worked late on the farm and then retired to his room to read the local newspapers or play haunting music on his violin. The children seemed content as they went to sleep due to the soothing nature of Maxon's playing. Ray Lamphere returned every once in a while to harass Bell, and Maxon warned her on the occasions when the embittered ex-suitor returned. Bell even had him arrested on several occasions for trespassing. Maxon often saw Lamphere spying on the homestead from a grove of elm trees on the edge of the property. On the evening of April 27, 1908, subsequent to the preparation of Bell's last will and testament, a fire broke out at the farm and nearly destroyed the whole property. As far as a suspect, local authorities arrested the one individual they believed had the motive to see any harm come to Bell, Ray Lamphere. Several days after the fire, Lamphere sat in the LaPorte jail, suspected of starting the fire and thus murdering Belle Gunness in the process. The headless corpse of a female had been found under the rubble of the house, and authorities believed this to be Belle Gunness. However, they failed to prove that at the time of Lamphere's arrest. Furthermore, town gossip seemed to be swayed in Lamphere's favor that he neither murdered Bell or set the fire to the farm. Additionally, none of the townspeople actually believed that the corpse found belonged to Belle Gunness. It was then that authorities, at the behest of the local population, looked more closely into Belle Gunness, as most of her suitors, according to the middle-aged woman, disappeared without warning. Questions arose as to whether Jenny Sorensen, Belle's young daughter who allegedly broke the heart of 19-year-old Emil Greening, actually left the farm to attend college in San Francisco. Although it took a little time, LaPorte authorities contacted the college that Jenny was supposed to attend, according to Belle Gunness, and they responded that they had no record of the young girl. Queries also surfaced that Belle seemed to be living a somewhat wealthy lifestyle, even though the farm never seemed to make any money. Where did the living expenses come from? As volunteers and law enforcement personnel dug through the rubble of the fire, answers to their questions became apparent. Men's watches, men's coat buttons, billfolds, all empty of course, were found in the debris. Then, more grisly discoveries. A human rib cage that appeared recently buried, a skeletal arm, then a whole skeleton was discovered in the rubble. Because of the hideous nature of the accusations that surfaced around Belle Gunness, Town Sheriff Al Smutzer wanted to keep the incident quiet until more evidence could be found at the scene of the fire. He hired Joe Maxson, Belle's former handyman, and a close neighbor, Daniel Hudson, to quietly sift through the rubble to see if they could locate the female head of the corpse, in addition to any other evidence they may find. Most importantly, Maxson and Hudson needed to keep whatever they found quiet. However, with hundreds of gawkers passing by the fire site every day, it became difficult to conceal findings as they occurred. In May of 1908, a small, diminutive man visited Sheriff Smutzer and claimed that he was Ashley Helgeline, the younger brother of Andrew. Ashley stated to authorities that he knew his brother arrived in South Dakota to withdraw funds from an account there, claiming that Belle was by his side at the withdrawal. Ashley knew when his brother arrived back in LaPorte, Indiana, and then read in the Norwegian newspaper about the fire on Belle Gunness's farm. Ashley came to investigate. Ashley explained to the authorities that he and his family found approximately 6 months' worth of letters that his brother and Belle wrote back and forth to each other, as Andrew found an advertisement in a mail-order bride column in the Scandinavian, the local newspaper in Norway. The letters specifically stated that Andrew was to travel to LaPorte, where he and Belle would then be married at her urging. Ashley also stated that Andrew entrusted Belle with over $1,800 of his savings, and he found it strange that his brother just left the money with her. Law enforcement then deciphered some of the written letters and denoted that Belle really desired money more than a man who was a faithful husband, lover, and provider for her family. The later letters gave Andrew instruction as to sewing paper money into his underwear when he traveled, and not to breathe a word of those instructions to anyone, not even his closest relations. Sheriff Smutzer doubted the rendition of Ashley's story, as the lawman believed Belle not to be a gold digger per se, but Ashley remained unconvinced that Belle was completely innocent in the disappearance of his brother. After all, Ashley Helgeline knew that digging took place at Belle's former residence and believed evidence of his brother's existence, or demise, may be found there. After relating the story of how his brother came to America at Belle's behest, Ashley went to speak to Maxson and Hudson because he felt somewhat of a hunch about the disappearance of his brother and who, at the time, may have been responsible. He offered to help the two men dig and questioned them as to whether Belle ever dug holes on her own. Maxson responded, "As a matter of fact, yes. There's a large garbage pit behind the house near the hog pen where she had been throwing old boots, ham bones, coffee tins, things like that. She had me covered in around March. Why?" Without replying to Maxson, Ashley retrieved a shovel and went to the area described by Maxson and began to dig. Because of his belief that his brother may have fallen victim to foul play at Belle's hands, the other two, almost immediately, began assisting with Ashley's excavation of the former garbage heap. After just a few minutes of digging, the three men found some old boots and then were hit with such a smell of decay they had to air out their lungs by moving away from the spot. As they continued digging in the spot, they discovered some old clothing and then something that had been covered with an oilcloth and a gunny sack. When they lifted the covering, they found a human arm. Digging further, they found the remains, and Ashley recognized the head with the grin to be that of his brother. The three men later discovered this man had been buried in pieces. His arms, legs, hands, and head, all buried in old flour sacks. Maxon, Hudson, and Ashley immediately summoned Sheriff Smutzer to the scene to observe their most recent discoveries. Throughout the continuing excavation, the three men, along with other volunteers, uncovered the bodies of 2 females and 2 males. The female body had been identified as Jenny Sorensen. Even though the remains decomposed rapidly, the authorities noted her blonde hair and facial features were still intact. Rumors quickly circulated that Jenny's suspicions arose about her foster mother when she noticed that suitors always left the residence in the middle of the night. The news of the discoveries quickly spread throughout Indiana, the Midwest, and finally the country, with other stories surfacing in Norway about the lonely Belle Gunness. Sheriff Smutzer could no longer contain the interest with the morbid finds, and soon the town became overrun with news media. Newsmen invaded the small town and took over the largest hotel there as a command center of sorts, deciphering any further stories that may arise from the excavations at the farm. When interviewing many of the local women about Belle Gunness, they appeared shocked that this once alleged genteel woman was described as being a Lady Bluebeard. The portrait of a hate-filled, money-grubbing immigrant soon became the news of the day. Questions surfaced as to all the farmhands that worked for Belle in hopes of courting her at the same time. Ole Budsberg, one of the farmhands that expressed his wish to be Belle's beau, went to the local bank to withdraw $1,800 while being escorted by the widow. Soon thereafter, Budsberg disappeared. When the cashier at the bank inquired as to where Budsberg may have gone, Belle answered with a great confidence that Budsberg moved to Oregon. Swan Nicholson, a recent resident to LaPorte, asked about the whereabouts of a friend he knew, Olaf Lindblom. Nicholson described Lindblom as young, about 30 years old, and a very handsome fellow. One of Belle's neighbors, Chris Christopherson, answered Nicholson's query by telling him that he remembered seeing Lindblom on Belle's property when he moved a privy off of the hole underneath it at the time. Christopherson related that Belle complained that once Lindblom moved the privy and failed to move it back, he left for St. Louis and she never saw him again. Then there was Henry Gerholt. He came to LaPorte and worked in the outdoor market there. He seemed very nice to the other residents and even more so to Belle. Henry helped Belle around her farm, and then one day she stated he left and ran off with a horse trader. Belle's farm appeared to be a revolving door of farmhands, as she went through so many that townspeople could not remember their names, nor could they attest to ever learning them. One boy, in particular, worked with Belle, and he was seen about the town with her on several occasions. One day, when Belle went to the butcher shop, someone asked her about the whereabouts of the boy, and she turned to a large piece of hanging beef and remarked what a lovely cut it would make. Soon, townspeople were aghast at remembering exactly how many farmhands and suitors that Belle had who suddenly left. In the middle of the night, of course. The digging at Belle's farm continued, and the fate regarding the missing men and boys became apparent. Throughout the month of May, searchers discovered the remains of Budsberg, Gerholt, and the young man that no one else could remember his name. Remains found had their heads detached from their bodies and their various other limbs scattered throughout their graves. At the bottom of one of the graves, searchers discovered the remains of a young boy whose wisdom teeth just started to come in at the time of his death. With these most recent revelations, an accusatory shadow descended upon Belle Gunness. Was she also responsible for the death of Mad Sorensen? And Peter Gunness, with his skull crushed by a meat grinder that mysteriously fell from the top shelf in the kitchen of the Gunness home? A doctor from Chicago, J.B. Miller, examined Sorensen at the time of his death and determined that the man exhibited signs of strychnine poisoning. But due to the suggestion of a superior, Dr. Miller never mentioned these details to Belle Gunness at the time of her husband's death so as to not cause her any more undue grief. Since Dr. Miller also treated Sorensen for a heart condition, he felt that the listing of a heart attack would not be seen as mysterious. Dr. Miller remained silent for the 8 years from Sorensen's death to the fire in LaPorte. Strangely enough, Sorensen just happened to expire when 2 life insurance policies seemed to overlap each other, therefore doubling the money that Belle received. A year later, when Peter Gunness died from the fractured skull, law enforcement expressed some suspicion in that case as well. The death bore the marks of what law enforcement considered mischief, and Belle gave the investigators no reasonable explanation as to how the meat grinder could have fallen the way it did and crushed her husband's skull. Police were so suspicious at the time that they even questioned whether Belle had anything to do with Peter Gunness's young son's death, who was under her care at the time the little one died. Authorities questioned Jenny about the incident and her step-parents' relationship with each other, even hinting that they believed that Belle murdered her husband in cold blood. Even at Peter Gunness's funeral, observers noticed that Belle moaned and whimpered as she covered her eyes with her hands. Every once in a while, as noticed by one of the mourners, she kept peeking alertly between them, her fingers, to check the effect she was making. Belle's behavior certainly drew the suspicions of several of the mourners who truly believed she was responsible for the death of her husband, if not the murderer herself. Her own daughter, Myrtle, believed that her mother murdered her father when she told a schoolmate that Belle hit Peter with a meat cleaver and killed him. The excavators continued to dig throughout the month of May and failed to locate a body that matched Belle's. This is not to say that the authorities believed that Ray Lamphere was not her accomplice. The district attorney pushed hard for an indictment, even while the digging continued, and Sheriff Smutzer brought pressure to bear upon the diggers to find something that pointed to Lamphere as the murderer. However, any defense mounted on Lamphere's behalf could point to the fact that all of Belle's children, Jenny, Myrtle, and Lucy, had been discovered in the rubble of the fire, but any female corpse matching that of Belle Gunness failed to appear. In order to secure an indictment, Sheriff Smutzer instructed his deputies and detectives to search high and low for any evidence implicating Lamphere on the murders of the children. While investigators searched for the evidence to bring charges against Lamphere, an unusual character stepped forward that claimed he could possibly help them with their investigation. Dr. Ira Norton, Belle Gunness's dentist, stated that if the diggers could find her head, he could identify whether the false teeth within that head belonged to Belle Gunness. Dr. Norton stated that he made Belle some false teeth the year before that were backed with some gold fillings. Sheriff Smutzer then received some help from another unlikely source, an old gold miner named Louis Schultz. Schultz stated that if the sheriff provided him with a sluice box, water and material run together over some sort of screen, that he would be able to find those teeth, if they existed, within a week. Sheriff Smutzer, trying anything to get the evidence that he and the district attorney desired to see Lamphere tried for murder, agreed to the request. Some of the citizens of LaPorte believed Belle dead because her account at the local bank still had approximately $750 left in it. Others believed Belle met her fate in the fire and Lamphere was the one solely responsible. Even the town's local newspapers could not make up their minds as to whether Belle Gunness remained alive or succumbed in the fire. Finally, on May 12, 1908, Schultz, after running some dirt through the sluice box, discovered a pair of dentures that Dr. Norton identified as having belonged to Belle Gunness. On May 22, 1908, a grand jury indicted Ray Lamphere for arson and felonious homicide of all the victims found during the excavations after the fire, including Belle Gunness. On May 29th, the constabulary held an auction for all the goods that proved salvageable from the fire. Auctioneers sold the family dog that survived the fire, the barn cat with her kittens, and the pony and cart. Joe Maxon, hounded constantly by the press, when asked if Bell was still alive, resounded with a firm yes every time asked the question. Maxson considered himself lucky that he escaped the fire and lived to tell about it. He related to his sister some years later that he awoke one evening with Bell standing at the foot of the bed. She asked him whether he was asleep and then promptly left the room. Maxson believed he could see the outline of a hammer beneath her skirt. Stories from her homeland of Norway emerged in the local newspaper, the Scandinavian, that told of narrow escapes by other gentlemen who answered Bell's advertisements for husbands. One of the men, a Carl Peterson, brought a letter to Laporte authorities that stipulated before she took their proposals seriously, every applicant must have a satisfactory deposit of cash or security. George Anderson from Missouri answered Bell's advertisement in a local newspaper and decided to travel to Indiana and investigate the farm. With only $300 in his pocket, Bell strongly suggested that he go back to Missouri, sell his farm, and then she would take his courtship seriously. Anderson decided not to do what Bell desired. It turned out that there were more men that answered Bell's advertisements in the hope of finding that perfect wife. Sheriff Smutzer received letters from other Midwestern families where friends of missing men wanted to discover whether Bell had anything to do with these disappearances. In July 1905, the family of George Barry expressed concerns that Barry left his home in Indiana with $1,500 in his pocket to work for Mrs. Gunness, and no one ever saw him again. Herman Konitzer, also from Indiana, withdrew $5,000 from his bank account and went to Laporte to marry a rich widow. Konitzer vanished without a trace. Abraham Phillips also answered Bell's advertisement and traveled from his home in West Virginia to Laporte to marry a rich woman. Phillips, a retired railway worker, took with him $500 in cash and a diamond ring. The family never heard from Phillips after that, and while Maxson and Hudson sifted through the debris of the fire, they found a railwayman's watch. Another man, Emil Tell, boarded a train from Kansas to Laporte with $5,000 within his billfold, telling his friends and family he was headed there to marry a widow. Again, he disappeared. Several other men never materialized after answering Bell's advertisements. Olaf Jensen from Norway, Christian Hinckley from Chetek, Wisconsin, Charles Nyberg from Philadelphia, Tonis Line from Rushford, Minnesota, E.J. Thiefland, Minneapolis, Minnesota, John E. Bunter, McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and the list appeared to be never-ending. On November 9, 1908, the trial of Ray Lamphere began with the choosing of a jury and the final preparations for both the prosecution and the defense. Lamphere pled not guilty. The actual trial opened on Friday morning, November 13th. One of the first witnesses called, Coroner Dr. Charles Mack, tried to convince the jury that the headless corpse discovered after the fire was that of Bell Gunness. Although Dr. Mack spoke very authoritatively regarding his findings from the remains he examined, the defense did punch holes in the coroner's credibility, and the jury demonstrated that they doubted whether the headless female corpse found in the rubble was that of Bell Gunness. Later, their minds would be changed. The defense seemed confident for an acquittal until the dentist, Dr. Norton, not only produced the dentures and identified them, but also Bell's teeth that once had been embedded within her jaw. A morbid souvenir, but these teeth were also found within the rubble of the fire. At this point, the defense lost any ground that they had gained with the discrediting of the coroner, but observers believed that Lamphere would be acquitted. When the trial continued on the following Monday morning, November 16th, the prosecution put Ray Lamphere upon the stand. The defendant testified as to his actions immediately following his firing and how Bell refused to pay him his back wages. The prosecution accused Lamphere of not only being responsible for Andrew Helgeline's death, as well as the fire that everyone believed killed Bell, but that the defendant knew of the graveyard. Another witness called to testify, William Slater, stated that Lamphere, in a drunken state of course, stated that he knew something of Bell that would land her into the penitentiary. The defense then put on their case before the court and called John Anderson, one of Bell's neighbors. Anderson claimed that he saw Belle Gunness almost 2 months after the fire walking down the road near his house. Anderson further stated that he had come down from his hayrack and looked toward the orchard where he saw Belle walking with another man. Anderson emphasized that he knew it was her due to the size of the woman, even from a distance. The witness tried to get to the orchard before the couple could make their escape, but Anderson proved too late. Several witnesses testified that they saw Belle after the fire walking in the backwoods around her farm. Rumors spread through the testimony of several witnesses that perhaps Belle engaged a naive body double that she murdered in her place to throw off any law enforcement pursuit. The last witness called to the stand by the defense on November 24, 1908, was Dr. Walter Haynes, a toxicology professor who tested contents of Andrew Helgeline's stomach and discovered large doses of strychnine, more than enough to kill a man. The defense also asked Dr. Haynes to analyze the stomachs of the 3 young children found after the fire and the headless corpse believed to be Belle. Dr. Haynes testified that the test results from those 4 examinations would be skewed, as all the organs were kept in the same jar as a strychnine solution. Therefore, he would not be able to ascertain whether the stomachs contained the poison or whether the organs absorbed the preservative within the jar. On November 25, 1908, after hearing all the arguments and evidence, the jury found Lamphere guilty of arson and arson only. The jury foreman then stood and made a statement. "We hereby state that it was our judgment in consideration of this case that the adult body found in the ruins of the fire was that of Belle Gunness, and that the case was decided by us on an entirely different proposition." The judge then sentenced Lamphere to 2 to 20 years in the state penitentiary. At least, the defendant thought he missed being hanged. A little more than a year after his sentencing, Lamphere contracted tuberculosis and died in prison on December 30, 1909. It appeared, in a philosophical sense, Lamphere became another victim of the matron of the boneyard. At the hour of his death, he admitted to the pastor that he did witness the murder of Andrew Helgeline, which prompted him to demand hush money from Gunness, who, instead, fired him, and when he went back to the farm to retrieve his belongings, she charged him with trespassing. What's more, days before the fire, they had traveled to Chicago to find and bring back a housekeeper who was believed to have become Belle's headless body double in the fire. While incarcerated, Lamphere spoke at length about his predicament to his cellmate, Harry Myers. When Myers was released after serving an indeterminate amount of time for his sentence, he related that Lamphere stated on several occasions that the body the court and the jury believed to be Belle Gunness possessed no scar on her right thigh. Lamphere reiterated that Belle had a large scar on her right thigh that the corpse did not possess. The LaPorte County Historical Society has stated that sightings of Belle occurred throughout the next 25 years. Even the defense attorney who worked with Lamphere, Wirt Wharton, continued to practice law in LaPorte, Indiana until 1943 when he passed away. Wharton, according to his wife, believed that Belle Gunness escaped the fire and went on to murder other men. On the muggy morning of August 4, 1892, Lizzie Borden discovered the battered body of her father, Andrew Borden, lying in a mangled disarray of bone and blood on the sitting room couch. It appeared that Andrew was caught off guard by the attack. Lizzie summoned the Borden's maid, Bridget Sullivan, also known as Maggie, after discovering her father's body, and ordered Sullivan to go and bring Dr. Seabury Bowen, Lizzie's doctor, and a neighbor named Adelaide Churchill to the house. Once the 3 were present at the Borden residence, Churchill and Sullivan walked up the staircase and noticed someone lying on the floor of one of the upstairs bedrooms. Churchill and Adelaide discovered the body of Abby Borden, her head bashed in as she appeared to be cleaning the bedroom upstairs. Dr. Bowen arrived as well and then immediately summoned the police to the Borden residence at 92 2nd Street, Fall River, Massachusetts. Once the police arrived, they made a search of the Borden residence for an intruder. They believe the killer may still be in the house. They also searched for a murder weapon and found 2 hatchets, 2 axes, and a hatchet head with a broken handle. The break in the handle appeared fresh, so authorities concluded that this must have been the murder weapon. Investigators found no blood on the implements, but only on the bodies themselves. As news of the murders spread throughout the small Massachusetts town of Fall River, crowds drew around the Borden residence and the murder scene quickly became contaminated with various people walking through the house as if the bodies were on display. Journalists invaded the residence and began speculating as to what exactly happened that morning. Additionally, the police allowed the family to clean the house as much as possible around their investigations. No one thought to examine anyone who was in the house at the time of the murders of blood-stained clothing or brain matter. Investigators quickly jumped to the conclusion that the murders had to be committed by someone within the house. Since Emma Borden, Lizzie's older sister, was away at a friend's house in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, she was eliminated as a suspect. Also, Maggie Sullivan, the maid, had been taking a nap, or so she claimed at the time the murders occurred. Focus soon zeroed in on Lizzie. 2 days subsequent to the murders, newspapers reported that Lizzie became the focus of the investigation, and rumors began to spread that she was in fact the murderer. When one examines the history of the Borden's relationship, looking through the lens of history, one can see the motive present that Lizzie possessed in seeing her father and stepmother dead. Lizzie was born on July 19, 1860 in Fall River, Massachusetts, to Sarah Anthony née Morse and Andrew Jackson Borden. This side of the Borden family did not exhibit the wealthy habits attributable to the other Bordens in Fall River. Andrew Borden worked hard his whole life as he did not benefit from the more affluent relatives. He started his career in building furniture and then, ironically, in coffins. He took the money he made from these ventures and dabbled in small real estate purchases, renting out the properties. Andrew Borden later went on to manage a bank, and at the time of his death, his fortune was valued at over $300,000, approximately equivalent to $10 million in today's economy. Although Andrew Borden could be considered rich by today's standards, considering his youth of hard work and toil, he was known to be very frugal. The home in which he lived at 92 2nd Street had no indoor plumbing or electricity, commodities that people with his wealth could afford very easily. Andrew's first wife, Sarah, passed away when Lizzie reached 2 years of age. Sarah made Emma, Lizzie's older sister by 10 years, promise to take care of her younger sister. Emma dutifully agreed. 3 years after Sarah's death, Andrew Borden married Abby Durfee Gray, a marriage that Lizzie believed Abby engaged in order to get at her father's wealth. Lizzie never warmed up to Abby, and later in their relationship, closer to the time of the murders, called her, quote, Mrs. Borden, end quote, instead of mother, and the relationship between the two was frosty at best. Maggie Sullivan stated later that Emma and Lizzie rarely ate their meals with Andrew and Abby. Emma and Lizzie drew ire over their father's, quote, gifts, end quote, of real estate to various members of Abby's family, including the giving of a house to Abby's sister. To quell the rumblings within the family, Andrew signed over a rental house to Emma and Lizzie, for which they purchased the house from their father for $1. A few weeks before the murder, the sisters sold the house back to their father for quite a handsome profit for the day, $5,000. Before the sale back to Andrew, Lizzie and Emma enjoyed the modest rental income the home generated, but this did not ease the tensions in the Borden household at all. In an effort to appease Lizzie in 1890, Andrew sent his daughter on a trip to Europe with some of the other Bordens from the, quote, the Hill, end quote, the ritzy part of town that the well-to-do Bordens inhabited. But Lizzie returned a little more frustrated at the way she lived compared to her wealthier cousins. After all, the trip to Europe was a highlight to Lizzie, as she didn't have much of a social life other than going to church and teaching Bible school, and both of the Borden sisters were cut off from the society of Fall River. Upon Lizzie's return from Europe, bizarre occurrences plagued the Borden household. In June 1891, someone robbed the house during the day when Andrew and Abby were not at home. Someone got into the house without alarming anyone, even though Lizzie, Emma, and Maggie never heard anyone entering or leaving the house. The intruder managed to get into Abby's desk and stole some cash, jewelry, and streetcar tickets. When the police arrived, Lizzie seemed relatively calm and led the police on a tour of the house where she pointed out that a screen door had been torn with a nail. It appeared from the investigation that no one could have gained access to the house, and the police focused their investigation for the robbery upon Lizzie. From that point forward, all the doors of the Borden house were locked. Even Andrew locked his bedroom door every day. Common knowledge around Fall River implicated Lizzie as a shoplifter. Several instances occurred where Lizzie stole something, and the clerks would make a note of the merchandise taken, and Andrew Borden would render the money for the items at a later date. This did not erase the stigma Lizzie created by being labeled a kleptomaniac. Rumors also spread that Lizzie decapitated Abby's cat and that Andrew Borden sacrificed Lizzie's pigeons that she kept in a coop in the barn, but these have never been confirmed throughout history. In July of 1892, a huge family argument erupted that prompted Emma and Lizzie to take, quote, extended vacations, end quote, away from the family home. Emma returned to the family home a few days later, but Lizzie remained in a local rooming house until her return 4 days later, a week before the murders. Additionally, a few days before the murder, the family got ill from eating some bad food. Abby mentioned to a particular doctor that she believed someone was trying to poison the family. The Bordens recovered very quickly. The day before the murders, John Vennicum Morse, the brother of Emma and Lizzie's mother, Sarah, arrived and was invited to spend a few nights in the guest bedroom so that he and Andrew could discuss some business matters. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and Emma ate a breakfast of mutton soup, the third day the family ate this, quote, delicacy, end quote, for a meal. Andrew Borden then left the house at approximately 9 a.m. to start his workday. He returned to the Borden residence at approximately 10:45, and when he tried to use his key to open the door, he couldn't unlock the front door. Andrew knocked until finally Maggie opened the door from the inside. Andrew stated that he felt a little under the weather. When she let Andrew into the house, she heard Lizzie laughing. Maggie didn't see Lizzie, but believed she heard Lizzie at the top of the steps. Investigators considered this fact very significant because they believed, after the inquest, that Abby was already dead. Lizzie subsequently claimed that a messenger brought Abby a summons to visit a sick friend. Lizzie also claimed that when her father was on the couch in the sitting room, she helped him take off his boots and then replace them with his slippers, a fact later discounted from the crime scene photos. Andrew then went into the sitting room and laid upon the short couch for a nap before eating lunch. Maggie claimed she felt ill after being instructed to wash the windows on the inside and the outside. She was awakened at approximately 11:10 a.m. after going to lay down for a nap when she heard Lizzie call to her from the first floor saying, quote, Maggie, come quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him. When Maggie went downstairs to answer Lizzie's call, she saw Andrew Borden lying on the couch in the sitting room, noticing his head looked like a mangled mess. When Maggie and Mrs. Churchill, the neighbor from next door, walked up the stairs at eye level, when they reached the landing of the second floor, they discovered Abby's body lying in the room where John Morse had spent the night. The police were finally called around 11:15 a.m. Police in Fall River had no experience with murder investigations. The most they had to deal with were prostitutes and drunks. Therefore, at the time of the Borden murders, the crime scene was trampled with curiosity seekers. It has been estimated that over 1,000 people gathered around the Borden home contaminating the crime scene. Photographs of the bodies were taken, and police conducted a search of the residence. But in 1892 Fall River, police dare not go through a woman's things looking for evidence. When questioned by the police at the residence, Lizzie was asked who may have murdered her father and mother. Lizzie immediately retorted, quote, "She's not my mother," end quote. Lizzie gave an account of her actions prior to the discovery of her father's body on the morning of the murders when she gave her statement to authorities.
Saw father when he returned from the post office. He sat down to read the paper. I went out to the barn, remained 20 minutes, returned and found him dead. Saw no one in the yard when going to or returning from the barn. Heard no noise whatever while in the barn.
1 week after Andrew and Abby Borden's death, W.A. Dolan, medical examiner for Fall River, along with his assistant, Dr. F.W. Draper, held the autopsies of the victims at the Oak Grove Cemetery, although there was a cursory autopsy in the parlor of the Borden home on the day of the murder. On the left side of the body, more importantly the head and face, the alienists noted that Andrew Borden suffered numerous, quote, incised wounds and one contused wound penetrating the brain, end quote. Andrew suffered 11 wounds in all. Abby suffered 18 wounds to the skull. Lizzie's story changed often and her facts became convoluted. Even when she appeared at the inquest, her facts seemed altered to fit her narrative of the story. 2 days after the murders, stories circulated that Lizzie may have planned the murders. Most significantly, Eli Bentz, a clerk at S.R. Smith's drugstore in Fall River, told police that Lizzie visited the store the day before the murder and attempted to purchase prussic acid, a deadly poison. Bentz claimed that Lizzie wanted the poison to clean a sealskin coat. Even though evidence mounted that Lizzie may be a murderess, crowds of people came to her defense, as evidenced in this opinion from the Boston Herald of August 10th. From the consensus of opinion it can be said, in Lizzie Borden's life there is not one unmaidenly nor a single deliberately unkind act. Because of the trauma that Lizzie allegedly experienced as a result of the murders, Dr. Bowen prescribed morphine that sedated her considerably. At the inquest, Lizzie answered some questions and refused to answer others. Her rendition of the facts confused and confounded authorities, and even the district attorney at the time became aggressive and confrontational in his quest for the truth. Due to her uncertainty and the authorities' dissatisfaction with her rendition of the events on the day of the murder, District Attorney Hosea Knowlton served Lizzie with a warrant for her arrest on August 11, 1892, and jailed her. A grand jury convened on November 7th, and on December 2nd, after considering all the evidence, indicted Lizzie Borden. She would stand trial for the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The community was shocked that authorities would charge a genteel woman in Victorian society for such violent murders. Fall River, Massachusetts made no accommodations for females in their jail, so authorities moved Lizzie from Fall River to Taunton, Massachusetts until the trial. After her incarceration in August, women's groups and others came to her defense. It was truly a case of where undue influences may have had an effect on the outcome. In this particular case, the press played an important part in the prosecution of the case due to the social mores of the time. Many asked how could a sweet, demure woman of Lizzie's standing commit such horrendous crimes. The trial began on the hot and sticky day of June 5, 1893, at the Bristol County Courthouse located in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The prosecution was represented by District Attorney Knowlton and future United States Supreme Court Justice William H. Moody. Lizzie was represented by what some historians have called the 19th century, quote, dream team, end quote. The defense consisted of Andrew Jennings, the Borden family attorney, and Melvin O. Adams, the former Massachusetts state governor. 5 days before the Borden trial, another axe murder occurred in Fall River. Once the murder was solved, it was determined that the person responsible was not in Fall River at the time of the Borden murders. Points of contention arose at the trial. One of them was the hatchet head found in the basement. The prosecution contended that the hatchet handle had been cut off by the murderer because it was covered in blood. Contradictory stories emerged between two police officers who claimed to have found the handle. They did not produce the said handle during the trial. Another point of contention came from Miss Alice Manley Russell. Miss Russell testified that she witnessed Lizzie Borden burning a dress on the kitchen stove on August 8, 1892, 4 days after the murder. Lizzie stated to Russell that the dress had been ruined when she brushed paint on it. Russell failed to testify as to whether the substance covered the dress appeared to have been blood. This fact was substantiated by the painter himself, but one question remained about the garment. Where was this dress at the time the police searched the house? Another important point of dispute came when the prosecution questioned Lizzie's timeline regarding her presence at the residence. Maggie Sullivan testified that she entered the second floor of the home at approximately 10:50 a.m., and she left Lizzie and Andrew Borden on the first floor at that time. Lizzie stated to several people that she went into the barn and did not go back into the house for 20 or 30 minutes. Hyman Lubinsky testified that he witnessed Lizzie leaving the barn at approximately 11:03 a.m. This testimony was substantiated with another witness named Charles Gardner. On the first day of the trial, unbeknownst to the bulk of the people in the gallery, the heads of the murder victims had been removed by the coroner immediately after the burial for an analysis of the wounds after the skin had been removed. Prosecutor Moody, in a dramatic gesture, threw a dress upon the prosecution table, knocking to the floor a bag that contained the skulls. Whether Moody did this on purpose or not has become a matter of conjecture to historians and researchers of the case. Obviously, the skulls were extracted to demonstrate the extent of the wounds to the heads of the victims, and the hatchet purported to be the murder weapon fit into the wounds with some precision. When the skulls fell out of the bag, Lizzie swooned, almost as if on cue. Also at this time, the judges ruled that the prussic acid purchasing incident would not be admitted, being too far removed in time. The exposure of the skulls and Lizzie's reaction to the exposure convinced some that she may have been coached. Her wardrobe and mannerisms during the course of the trial indicated a certain morbid choreography. Lizzie appeared as the genteel Victorian female who was wrongly accused of the crime that her manners and upbringing deemed impossible. D.A. Knowlton tried to use Lizzie's inquest testimony against her at the trial, but technically, Lizzie was under arrest at the inquest and did not enjoy the benefit of counsel at the time. Therefore, the court ruled that the statements at the inquest could not be used against her at the trial. This stood as a great blow to the prosecution. Despite the vast array of witnesses that were paraded in front of the jury, the trial lasted approximately 15 days, and most of the evidence was circumstantial and presented reasonable doubt as to Lizzie's guilt. Although some of the testimony and evidence produced swoons from the gentler sex in the gallery, nothing pointed conclusively to Lizzie as the murderer. At the end of the trial, when the jury was to deliberate, Associate Justice Justin Dewey, one of the 3 justices appointed to the court circuit and who had heard the Borden trial, gave a summary of the case to the jury that appeared to favor the defense. Justice Dewey cited Lizzie's character and the family name, while at the same time questioning the prosecution's experts. The jury then deliberated for an hour and a half before they returned the verdict. They found Lizzie Borden not guilty of the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. In fact, the jury made a very quick decision, but waited an hour before they announced the decision, making it appear that they took a long time to deliberate the verdict. Before the verdict was announced, the court requested whether she had anything to say before a sentence was pronounced, and Lizzie stated confidently, quote,
I am innocent. I let my counsel speak for me.
Those supporting Lizzie cheered when the verdict was announced. Now finally, she and Emma would be able to enjoy their father's fortune and would enjoy the life they felt they should have enjoyed and not living as a miser like their father. But just because a jury acquitted her did not mean that Fall River society would accept Lizzie back with open arms. The women of Fall River shunned and ostracized her, but Lizzie paid them no mind. Since the death of her father, she could live the life she always wanted. 6 months after the murder, Lizzie and Emma purchased a house on, quote, the Hill, end quote, the more affluent part of Fall River, where Lizzie named the mansion, quote, Maplecroft, end quote. Lizzie also changed her name, not officially though, to, quote, Lisbeth Andrew Borden, end quote. possibly in an attempt to escape the dark cloud of being a murderess. Feeling the freedom that her newfound wealth had brought her, Lizzie traveled extensively to places such as Boston, Washington, D.C., and New York. On one of her travels to Boston in 1904, she met an actress by the name of Nance O'Neill, whose real name was Gertrude Lamson. The two women grew very close, and rumors began to fly that they were engaged in a lesbian relationship. Lizzie held parties at Maplecroft, which included the theater troupe to which O'Neill belonged. In a small town such as Fall River, actresses and members of the theater held a social standing slightly above prostitutes. Historians have theorized that this is the argument that Lizzie and Emma engaged in. After this argument, Emma moved from Maplecroft and left Lizzie alone. The two would never speak to each other again. Lizzie periodically made the news and was even accused of stealing some porcelain paintings from a gallery in Fall River, but she settled the matter before it could escalate. In 1927, Lizzie Borden died from pneumonia. Emma died 9 days later. In Lizzie's will, she left $30,000 to the Fall River Humane Society, demonstrating that her love of animals would transcend her death. Lizzie also took care of her servants generously, but left Emma nothing. A few years after her death, Lizzie's nurse who cared for her after her gallbladder surgery stated that Lizzie made a confession that she had a boyfriend whom Andrew Borden despised. The nurse, Ruby Cameron, stated that the boyfriend, according to Lizzie, committed the murders. This story has never been corroborated. Other than Andrew Borden's wealth, not much as far as motive has been examined over the years as to why Lizzie Borden would commit such horrendous acts. Over the last 20 years, though, a theory explaining the destruction of Andrew Borden's face materialized with accusations of incest between the elder Borden and his natural daughters. The murderer exhibited unequaled rage with the murder of Andrew, and this is telling of a characteristic of the murderer. However, there is no other evidence to support this assertion. In 1997, students at the Stanford Law School decided to put Lizzie Borden on trial once again, with the audience to the event acting as the jury. And again, they found her not guilty. Former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor presided over the trial. Many assumptions have occurred over the years as to the true nature of the Borden murders. Some say that Lizzie and Maggie Sullivan committed the murders on their own and that these two carried on a scandalous affair until Abby discovered them together. Some historians state that John Morse murdered Andrew and Abby Borden due to some shady business dealings. One thing is certain, especially when it comes to Andrew's death. He was alive when Lizzie went to the barn and was dead upon her return. Who was in the house? Who beside Lizzie had a motive? Did Emma resort to violence to, quote, save, end quote, her younger sister? Lizzie never reacted to the discovery of her father's body in a way typical of 19th century Moors. Others watching the case from the outside couldn't believe that Lizzie never fainted as a genteel woman at the sight of such a horrific spectacle. The man found dead in his cell was known as Karl Denke, a native of one of the small Silesia villages. His father was a well-to-do farmer. Denke was not a very good student, and at the age of 12 ran away from home. Soon thereafter, Denke found himself apprenticed as a gardener. When the young man was 25, his father passed away, and his brother took over their father's farm. But Denke received a small inheritance from his father's estate, where he took the proceeds and purchased a small farm for himself in Jengbice. After a certain amount of time, Denke proved to be a failure at farming. He found himself having to sell his land and then purchasing a small house with a shed located on Stowawa Street in Jengbice in Silesia. But after World War I, with the onslaught of a debilitating inflation, Denke lost most of the proceeds he received from his inheritance and after he purchased his new residence. Denke lost the residence due to tax problems, but continued to rent the apartment on the ground floor on the right side of the same house, and 2 extra rooms starting in 1921. From all accounts, Denke led a pretty decent life and maintained a decent reputation amongst the citizenry of the small town of 8,000 people. Additionally, Denke seemed to lead a very low-class but dignified lifestyle, helping beggars, allowing them to stay overnight in his apartment. Furthermore, Denke played the organ at his local church and carried crosses for local funerals. At these solemn events, Denke came into contact with vagrants and migrants coming through the town. He would find them places to stay for the night before allegedly sending them on their way. It has been estimated that as many as 40 migrants stayed at the older man's abode before leaving the town, never to be seen again. Because of his benevolent behavior, the police granted Denke a vending license to make some more money. From then on, he sold leather suspenders, belts, shoes, and shoelaces. Denke also sold jars of pickled pork for people to eat. What the police did not realize is that the products Denke sold held a bloody and grisly secret. At first, Denke seemed to be very kind-hearted, making the best of an economically depressed situation for everyone involved. Residents of this small town reasoned that Denke was nothing but a kindly old man that attended church. During the war, the area of Poland where Denke resided had been under the control of the Germans, and, quote, uncontrollable hyperflation made German marks virtually worthless, end quote. Desperate times called for desperate measures. So, in the eyes of historians, Denke made use of the goods he found available at the time. Denke began selling, quote, meat goods, end quote, that he packaged in neat little pickle jars. With the food shortages that ran rampant during post-World War I Germany and the surrounding European countries, his products saw a high volume in sales. People were starving and saw the local meat dealer to be somewhat of a salvation. That is, until a winter afternoon in 1924. On that day, December 21st, at approximately 1 p.m. that afternoon, a young man covered in blood ran to his local police station and claimed that Denke tried to kill him with a pickaxe. The young man, one Vincenz Oliver, was a vagrant, and Denke proved to be a fine, upstanding citizen that locals revered for his work with helping people down on their luck. And besides, Denke was a churchgoer. A doctor later confirmed that Oliver had been attacked with a sharp instrument. Begrudgingly, police finally paid a call to Denke and arrested him at his residence. When police questioned Denke at the station, he readily admitted he attacked Oliver, but only to defend the vagabond against any intrusion into his property. A few hours later, after the conclusion of the interrogation, people found Denke dead in his cell, having hanged himself with a handkerchief. Police thought the suicide odd and traveled to Denke's residence to do some investigating on their own. After all, what did they think they would find from a man so well respected in his own community? In a report issued by Friedrich Petruski, interim head of the Institute of Legal Medicine in Breslau, he exposed what authorities found. The first findings made at Denke's house during the search were bones and pieces of meat. The latter were in a salt solution found in a wooden drum. There were altogether 15 pieces with skin, 2 parts of the breast, which were strongly hairy. The torso is cut through the middle, 3 fingers above the navel. Its lateral limit is the front shoulder blade. In the piece of the anterior abdominal wall, the middle of the navel is visible. The remaining pieces belong to the side and back parts. The largest is about 40 by 20 centimeters large. Particularly striking was a very clean anus with large parts of the buttocks. The authorities provided descriptions of the meat as having a brownish-red color and felt as if, quote, the body would not have lost much blood, end quote. All indications from the discoloration of the found skin determine that the dismemberments took place after death. Because no, quote, vital reaction, end quote, took place, authorities believed that the bodies were not taken apart while alive. Some muscles from the necks and backs appeared missing, as well as parts that included the head, arms, legs, and sexual organs. When the authorities examined the stove, they noticed 3 medium-sized pots filled with a cream sauce with cooked meat partially covered with skin and human hair. Quote, "The meat was pink and soft. All pieces seemed cut from the gluteal area. One pot had only half a portion." End quote. Police surmised that Denke must have eaten the other part before his incarceration. Police also found human flesh that appeared half-eaten and assumed, without any real evidence, that Denke must have consumed the pieces of flesh before his arrest. Police also assumed that human meat that they discovered in the Denke residence must have been sold in the, quote, "pickled jars," end quote, that Denke peddled throughout the town. In concluding his report, Petruski stated, "I should like to mention here that there is no evidence that Denke has ever sold the meat of his victims. All evidence has obviously been eaten. However, it seems certain that his guests, that is, the vagabonds, were offered to eat it." One of the most interesting facets to this report is that Petruski's report was written nearly a year after Denke's death. Quote, "The legend of selling human meat on the market must have been widespread since the discoveries made in Munsterberg," end quote, and it must have been compelling enough for Petruski to mention it in his report. Petruski also documented in his report that in the third pot, authorities found several pieces of human skin and, quote, "parts of the aorta in a gelatinous mass," end quote. A bowl found on the table in the kitchen contained an amber-colored fat that appeared to be human. A later test to the product in the bowl proved negative for any human proteins. When the authorities moved to the small shed beside the residence, they discovered even more of a chamber of horrors. The investigators discovered a barrel beset full of bones that appeared cleaned of the tendons and muscles that most probably had been cooked. Additionally, 6 forearm bones had been found, leading investigators to hypothesize that at least 3 people had been murdered. A leg bone was found in the pond that Denke had dug several years before, and other bones scattered about the woods behind the residence. When the final tally became known, the investigators found 16 femurs, 2 pairs of thin bones, 6 pairs, and 2 left femurs, 15 medium-sized pieces of long bones, 4 pairs of elbow bones, 7 head of radii, 8 lower parts of the elbow, a pair of upper shin bones, a pair of lower elbows and radii, of which the extremities stayed well connected, a pair of upper arms and a pair of upper arm heads, a pair of collarbones, 2 shoulder blades, 8 heels and ankle bones, 120 toes and phalanx, 60 feet and metacarpal bones, and 5 first ribs and 150 pieces of ribs. In the forest adjacent to the house, investigators also located parts of a spine and 4 parts of a clean, dissected male pelvis, with only one side demonstrating any signs of being cut with a saw. Only one piece of a human head had been found. Because of the condition of the bones, Petruski affirmed that some of the bones were from a strong individual, while some of the other denoted a delicate bone structure. From the marks where the bones appeared to have been separated, Petruski noted that some of the marks appeared very jagged, while others appeared to have been cut with an axe or some visibly sawed at the separation point. Some of the, quote, articulations, end quote, appeared to have been made with a knife. Petruski stated, finally, that the bones he examined belonged to a total of 8 persons. Not all of the bones would be discovered until well after World War II, when new tenants took over the residence. Furthermore, Denke kept a collection of the teeth of his victims, found in a, quote, money bag and 2 tin boxes, end quote, that totaled 351. Because investigators and forensic professionals estimated that the bones of only 8 persons were found at the residence, they placed the total of victims to be much higher considering the number of teeth discovered. One of the alienists believed that the teeth, if all put together, added up to approximately 25 individuals. Some of the teeth appeared to have been taken quite easily, while others seemed to experience some sort of trauma in extraction. The only thing that authorities could not ascertain were the ages of the victims. More shockingly, and even more grotesque, appeared that even though Denke may not have eaten some of his victims, or even sold their meat, he did use human parts to make the various products that he sold, including, but not limited to, belts of human skin, suspenders from dried and leathered tendons, and even an attempt to make a hat of human skin. Some of the shoelaces that he sold were made of the very tightly braided human hair. What became even more incriminating, police discovered various identification cards and the private papers of several persons. More interestingly, investigators discovered several loose pieces of paper where Denke had apparently written the names of his victims with the dates he murdered them in column form. The identification cards found in Denke's room matched most of the names on the list he kept, leading police to strongly surmise that these were the victims. Denke even mentioned in the list the weight of the victim and the manner in which he dismembered their bodies. To accomplish this tearing apart of human lives, the authorities discovered 3 axes, a large wood saw, a tree saw, a pickaxe, and 3 very sharp knives. Each of the weapons later confirmed the presence of human blood. Petruski later documented what he discovered about Denke's life and sensed that people thought the old man strange as he sought solitary confinement for himself with a certain sexual indifference, and some speculated that he was, quote, neither man nor woman, end quote. Family members described him as gluttonous whenever he attended a family gathering, which was rare, and even then he consumed large quantities of meat at one sitting. Even though he exhibited this type of excessive eating behavior, people who claimed to know him stated that he had, quote, good manners, humble behavior, and occasional charity, end quote, which earned him the nickname of, quote, Father Denke, end quote. Investigators and later historians hypothesized that Denke, who failed at farming and anything else, found a way to maintain a steady supply of food through murdering and dismembering those members of society that no one seemed to care for and who would never be missed, while, at the same time, appearing to be a caring individual who sought to help his fellow man. But one must ask the question, how could this man carry on this torture and dismemberment chamber for over 15 years without even the slightest bit of suspicion? It had been documented that several complaints lodged by Denke's neighbors told of a horrifying odor coming from his living quarters. Police later learned that 2 men escaped from Denke's clutches before Oliver ran for his life, accusing the old man of a fiendish act. And Denke exhibited such strange behavior that it is simply unthinkable how he would not have been captured sooner. After all, it is impossible that he could not have been seen carrying large bags from his residence into the woods, considering that is where investigators discovered most of the bones. One theory suggests that perhaps the townspeople knew or strongly suspected Denke's nocturnal habits, as they often heard sawing and cutting in the middle of the night. It's just that as long as none of the town's inhabitants were added to the long list of victims, they considered themselves safe. Between 9:15 and 9:45 p.m. on the evening of March 1, 1932, a makeshift ladder was placed outside the second-story window of 21-month-old Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr., the son of the famed aviator Charles A. Lindbergh. Once the person who set the ladder made their way to the second story, he or they entered the window of the baby's nursery and approached the crib. Little Charlie was asleep and raised no alarm. The intruder then made his way back to the window and back down the ladder, disappearing into the night. When the baby's nurse, Miss Betty Gow, went to check on the baby at approximately 10 p.m., she found the crib empty. Miss Gow called to Charles Lindbergh, who sat on the first floor, and he ran to the baby's nursery. When Lindbergh arrived, he found a ransom note on the windowsill, and as he looked out of the window, he noticed a rickety ladder leaning against the side of the house outside of the baby's window. Some renditions of Lindbergh's actions that night stated that he immediately opened the note, then searched frantically throughout the house for little Charlie. Then Lindbergh searched the grounds of the estate, but to no avail. The note warned the Lindberghs, Charles Sr. and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, not to notify the police if they expected their child to be returned unharmed. Lindbergh contacted the police nevertheless. The kidnapping of little Charlie began a media circus due to Lindbergh's celebrity status as an American hero, having been the first pilot to make the nonstop flight from New York to Paris. Immediately, the New Jersey State Troopers flocked to the Lindbergh estate in Hopewell, New Jersey, and under the command of former Army Major General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., father of the Desert Storm Commander, Lieutenant General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr., the investigation took on an amusement park type of air. At first, it seemed that the investigation took direction from Lindbergh himself, and those observing the case noticed that Lindbergh's movements and the actions the day and night of the kidnapping proved somewhat suspicious of a man whose son had just been kidnapped. Firstly, there were only a few people who knew that the Lindberghs would be at the Hopewell estate that day and evening. Normally, Anne and Charles Lindbergh stayed at her family estate nearby. The Hopewell estate was under construction, but inhabitable. Although Lindbergh was hailed as an American hero, he still valued the privacy of the new house. Furthermore, Lindbergh was scheduled to deliver a speech before the New York University Alumni Association on that night of March 1, 1932. Normally, Lindbergh maintained a very tight schedule when it came to public appearances. But on this evening, he failed to make this appearance and did not even notify them that he would not be there. Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. used unorthodox methods that went against police protocols to find his son. He even engaged a local mobster, Mickey Roaster, by giving the known criminal a copy of the ransom note found in little Charlie's room the night of the kidnapping. Even Al Capone, serving time in a federal prison, offered to help to find the missing child for a reduction in his sentence. Capone's request was not taken seriously and politely rejected. On March 6, 1932, a second ransom note appeared at the Lindbergh residence. This time, the kidnapper or kidnappers demanded $70,000. Another ransom note was received by Lindbergh's attorney on March 8, 1932, and stipulated that any intermediary between the Lindberghs and the kidnappers that the family selected would not be accepted. On that same day, Dr. John F. Condon, a retired high school principal from the Bronx in New York, placed a personal advertisement in the newspapers offering to act as the intermediary between them and the Lindberghs, and further offering to pay an additional $1,000 to the kidnappers for the position. On March 9th, the suspected kidnappers sent a third ransom note to Dr. Condon, therefore passively accepting him as the intermediary between the kidnappers and the Lindberghs. Lindbergh approved the measure, and Dr. Condon, nicknamed Jafsy through newspapers as a code name, waited for the kidnapper or kidnappers to contact him. On March 10, 1932, Dr. Condon received $70,000 in cash to render the ransom to the kidnappers. At approximately 8:30 p.m. on March 12, 1932, Dr. Condon received an anonymous telephone call and subsequently received another ransom note instructing the former principal to look for a further message located beneath a vacant stand 100 feet away from a subway station. Dr. Condon found the note and received instructions to travel to Woodlawn Cemetery near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue. Dr. Condon met a man calling himself John at the cemetery. Dr. Condon, at first, was accompanied by a bodyguard until he actually met John. In his conversation with John, Dr. Condon suggested that the kidnapper or kidnappers provide some proof that little Charlie was still alive. The stranger agreed. Dr. Condon left the cemetery and continued to maintain contact with John, struggling to keep the lines of communication open and Lindbergh's openness to paying the ransom. On March 16th, a baby sleeping suit arrived at the residence of Dr. Condon along with another ransom note. Dr. Condon then brought the suit to Lindbergh for him to positively identify the clothing as that belonging to little Charlie. On March 21st, Dr. Condon received another ransom note where the author strongly suggested that Dr. Condon and the Lindberghs needed to comply strictly with the demands issued to ensure the safe return of little Charlie, and letting Dr. Condon and the Lindberghs know that the kidnapping had been planned for over a year. On March 30th, another ransom note arrived where the kidnappers threatened to increase the ransom to $100,000. It appeared as though the kidnappers kept moving the target as a 10th and finally an 11th ransom note arrived. The 10th note advised Dr. Condon to have the ransom money ready for the following evening. The 11th note merely gave the good doctor directions to finding the 12th note. This mysterious scavenger hunt began to play on the nerves of the Lindberghs and the authorities. Dr. Condon found a 12th note under a stone in front of a greenhouse at 3225 East Tremont Avenue, Bronx, New York, as instructed in the previous message, and then proceeded to the same cemetery and met again with John, and then handed him $50,000 after the stranger approved the reduction in the ransom money. John then handed a note to Dr. Condon as to where little Charlie could be located. The note stated that there was a boat near Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts named Nellie, where the baby could be located. A search of the vineyard came up empty. The baby was not there. Sadly and tragically, on May 12, 1932, two men, Orville Wilson and Wilbur Allen, related their story of a gruesome discovery made in the woods near the home of the Hopewell estate. The two men drove down the road near the estate to deliver a load of lumber when they stopped on the side of the road after noticing something unusual about 75 yards from the road. Quote, "I jumped from the truck, leaped over the fence, and ran down a little gully up the side of the hill," end quote, Wilson stated. Quote, "There I saw the body. It was lying face downward and badly decomposed. A few curly locks still stuck to the back of the skull," end quote. Wilson continued that he and Allen examined the body more closely and appeared that the body had been, quote, "thrown under the bushes," end quote. Someone made a very hurried attempt to cover the body with leaves and branches, but obviously did not do a very thorough job. Wilson and Allen then went into Hopewell to report what they found to the local police chief, Charlie Williamson. Chief Williamson then called the New Jersey State Police, who went out to the site and picked up the baby's corpse. When asked to identify the remains, Lindbergh provided a positive identification that the baby found near his estate was, in fact, Charles A. Lindbergh, Jr., little Charlie. Lindbergh's behavior after the identification of his son seemed quite odd at the time. After a coroner examined the body and determined the cause of the child's death, death was caused by 2 heavy blows to the child's skull. The autopsy indicated that little Charlie had been dead for 2 months, which means whoever kidnapped the child murdered him not too long after. Or the baby may have hit his head on the ladder during the kidnapping. Lindbergh immediately ordered the cremation of his son after the autopsy was completed. This denied his wife, Anne, a Christian burial for the child. There has never been any documentation as to her actual reaction other than the outward expression of grief over the death of her young son. After the discovery of the body, Colonel Schwarzkopf demanded a conference with all those law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation and made it perfectly clear that the whereabouts of the Lindberghs are not to be discussed with anyone not involved in the investigation. The Lindberghs left the area and traveled to Europe to escape the publicity from the whole sordid incident. Meanwhile, the trail of the kidnappers and murderers went cold. Early in the investigation, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover made his agency available to the New Jersey State Police Superintendent Schwarzkopf. On May 13, 1932, after the discovery of the baby's body in the woods, President Franklin D. Roosevelt informed all government agencies to put themselves at the disposal of the New Jersey State Police, New York City Police, and any agency that may be involved in the active investigation of the Lindbergh case, and that the FBI, quote, would act as a clearinghouse and coordinating agency for all investigations in this case conducted by federal investigative units. The FBI then notified banks in the greater New York area to keep a close watch for the ransom money since they were coordinating closely with the other state and regional agencies to catch the culprits. In May 1932, the New Jersey State Police offered a reward not to exceed $25,000 for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the culprits responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Charlie Lindbergh. This announcement was forwarded to all law enforcement agencies across the United States. The Lindbergh case took on another casualty. Violet Sharp, a waitress in the home of Lindbergh's mother-in-law, Mrs. Dwight Morrow, committed suicide by ingesting poison when she faced re-questioning from authorities. After law enforcement investigated her movements on the night of the kidnapping, they came to the conclusion that Sharp had no connection with the abduction of little Charlie. With the death of the all-American baby boy, the public was stunned with the news of little Charlie's death. More importantly, outrage became the course of the day, and the denizens of the United States demanded blood for the murder of the Lindbergh son. One media outlet at the time exclaimed,
"Newspapers and radio broadcasting companies flashed the tragic news to the public. The papers halted their presses to jam out extras, and the radio stations cut into programs to announce bulletins. Audible gasps escaped from those on the streets as the news came to them, and the cries of newsboys are from radio loudspeakers suspended in front of stores."
Dr. Condon raised everyone's hopes that the murderers would be found when he proclaimed that he could identify the kidnapper. Dr. Condon bragged, quote, "I know the kidnapper of the Lindbergh baby, and he will be caught. I know his name, his nationality, his physical characteristics, and all about him," end quote. Most investigators believed that Dr. Condon was a crank, and his interjection into the case seemed very bizarre. Jaffe made the claim that he could identify the kidnapper by 2 10-second meetings at night from a distance of a few feet. Beginning in August 1934, the gold certificates used as the ransom began to surface in Yorkville and Harlem, New York. The investigation continued, and authorities followed numerous leads, but the trail of the murderers grew cold. That was until September 17, 1934, when a gas station attendant in Bronx, New York, serviced a man in a car that paid for the gas with a $10 gold banknote, one of the ransom bills. The attendant took the license number of the car down on the bill so he would not be made responsible for the $10. On the next day, September 18th, after law enforcement traced the bill through the bank, they discovered the address of the man who passed the gold certificate, and the federal and local authorities maintained surveillance at the home of one Bruno Richard Hauptmann. As they watched the house, on September 19, 1934, authorities closed in and arrested Hauptmann. When police searched Hauptmann's garage, they discovered $13,000 of the ransom money. Hauptmann stated that he was holding the money for his business partner, a mysterious figure known as Isidore Fish. Hauptmann added that Fish left the money with him, allegedly left for Germany, paying for his ticket with the ransom money, and, conveniently for Hauptmann, died there. After Hauptmann's arrest, the media already convicted him when they announced in their newspapers and on the radio that some of the ransom money was found in Hauptmann's possession. Furthermore, when authorities found the money, it was wrapped in newspapers from the month of September 1934, not March 1932, when the kidnapping and, according to the coroner, the murder of little Charlie took place. Even though Hauptmann's wife alibied him for the kidnapping and murder, the circumstantial evidence against Hauptmann mounted steadily despite the alibis provided by independent witnesses and his wife. In the Supreme Court for Bronx County, New York, Hauptmann was indicted for extortion charges, and on October 8, 1934, a Hunterdon County, New Jersey court indicted Hauptmann for murder. The trial of the state of New Jersey versus Bruno Richard Hauptmann began on January 3, 1935, in Flemington, New Jersey. Police relied heavily on a few things that the prosecution used in the trial. Firstly, the ladder used in the kidnapping appeared to have been constructed from some wood that Hauptmann allegedly obtained from the attic of the apartment building in which he lived with his wife and young child. Tool marks used on the wood to construct the ladder appeared to have been made with tools that Hauptmann owned. One odd fact surfaced that the police could not find Hauptmann's fingerprints on the ladder itself. Secondly, police found Dr. Condon's number on a closet door frame in the Hauptmann's residence. Thirdly, a handwriting expert compared the ransom notes to Hauptmann's handwriting and determined the notes matched. But later, facts emerged that the notes given to the expert were altered to match Hauptmann's handwriting. When the prosecution called Lindbergh to the stand to hear his testimony, he clarified that he recognized Hauptmann's voice as the man he heard at the cemetery when he accompanied Dr. Condon in April 1932. Most believed the American hero, but by his own admission, Lindbergh stood some 75 yards away from Dr. Condon and John and testified positively that Hauptmann's voice was the one he heard. Dr. Condon also identified Hauptmann as the man he met in the cemetery on April 2, 1932. The trial lasted approximately 5 weeks and based solely on circumstantial evidence. A jury convicted Hauptmann of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. Hauptmann would protest the verdict and maintain his innocence. The defense appealed the conviction, and the Supreme Court for the state of New Jersey upheld the verdict of the lower court on October 9, 1935. The U.S. Supreme Court also refused to hear the case and maintained the lower court's ruling, slating Hauptmann's execution for January 17, 1936. On this same day, New Jersey State Governor Harold G. Hoffman granted a 30-day reprieve. On February 17, 1936, Hauptmann was resentenced to be electrocuted during the week of March 30, 1936. After a refusal for clemency by the New Jersey Pardon Board, Hauptmann died in the New Jersey electric chair at approximately 8:47 p.m. Until the very end, Hauptmann denied being the demonized kidnapper and murderer of Charles A. Lindbergh, Jr. But even during and immediately after the trial, doubts surfaced as to whether Hauptmann acted alone or whether if he, in fact, was the true perpetrator of such a heinous crime. Several questions arose regarding the night of the kidnapping and the murder of Charles A. Lindbergh, Jr. that still reverberate to this day. On the night of little Charlie's disappearance, Tuesday night, March 1, 1932, this was the first Tuesday night that the Lindberghs spent at the Hopewell estate. Since the house was still under construction, the Lindberghs only visited the estate on weekends. Because Charlie had a cold, Ann Lindbergh, the baby's mother, decided that the family should stay one more evening. The question remains, if the Lindberghs didn't know whether they would be there that night, how did the kidnappers know? Since the case's disposition and Hauptmann's execution, suspicion has been cast on Lindbergh himself. Several factors pointed to Lindbergh as a suspect in the kidnapping and murder of his own son, but because of his celebrity status, few actually suspected that Lindbergh would stage such an elaborate ruse. However, the actions of the American hero on the night of the kidnapping and thereafter draw into question whether Lindbergh actually wanted to see his son disappear. Firstly, Lindbergh was scheduled to speak in front of the New York University alumni dinner. Lindbergh was known to be highly reliable when engaged with such events, but on this particular night, he did not show up to the dinner and did not call to cancel his appearance. Why did Lindbergh suddenly become untrustworthy unless he had to be at home with his wife and child for some other reason? While sitting in his living room with his wife, Ann, Lindbergh stated that on the night of the kidnapping that he heard the sound of wood snapping outside. And yet, Ann Lindbergh and the other servants present in the house that night claimed to have heard nothing. 3 weeks prior to the kidnapping, Lindbergh, with his penchant for cruel practical jokes, took the baby and hid him in a closet, thus causing panic amongst the servants that Charlie was missing. On the night of the kidnapping, Betty Gow, Charlie's nurse, went up to the nursery to check and see if Charlie was sleeping. When she noticed the crib empty, she just figured that Lindbergh played another cruel practical joke. When Lindbergh went up to the nursery and noticed the crib empty, he stated to his wife, who stood at his side, quote, "Ann, they have stolen our baby," end quote. It might also be added that Lindbergh did not display any particular panic that his child had been stolen. When Ann Lindbergh and the servants were in the nursery, they did not see that ransom note that Lindbergh himself discovered on the windowsill of the nursery. Yet, he found it. The first ransom note was different from the remainder of the other ransom notes with reference to the handwriting. From the very beginning of the case, Lindbergh took charge of the investigation. Although his celebrity status could bestow upon him any number of honors, An experienced detective was not one of them. Lindbergh insisted that all facets of the investigation be brought to him, and he even threatened the New Jersey State Police that if this protocol were not followed, he would shoot anyone who did not comply. Lindbergh became so obsessed with the investigation that when J. Edgar Hoover sent 2 agents to assist with the investigation, he angrily sent them away. Lindbergh's excuses for his behavior stem from, according to the alleged bereaved father, that he was concerned for the safe return of his son. But why assume that you have investigator acumen when other law enforcement professionals, including the FBI, were devoting all their resources to finding your kidnapped son? Other facets of Lindbergh's actions on the night of the kidnapping deserve closer scrutiny as well. For instance, Lindbergh called his wife to let her know he would be late, yet showed up at 8:25 p.m. on March 1, 1932. Furthermore, he forgot to bring Charlie's little dog that normally slept under the baby's crib. When he first discovered the first ransom note, Lindbergh called Betty Gow to the nursery and then sent her downstairs to get a knife to open the note. Then, suddenly, he refused to open the note and instead opted to hand it over to the police. Any normal father would have opened the note with all haste. The most important action Lindbergh took was the cremation of his son immediately after the autopsy. This seems, although quite heartless, to fall along the lines of destroying evidence. In addition to Lindbergh himself, several other suspects surfaced throughout the 87 years since the kidnapping. The nursemaid, Betty Gow, had a boyfriend of questionable reputation who knew the location of little Charlie on that night. Moreover, Anne Morrow Lindbergh's sister, Elizabeth, was in attendance at the Hopewell estate that evening. Prior to marrying Anne, Lindbergh dated Elizabeth. Did she plan the kidnapping as revenge against the aviator for marrying her sister? Common knowledge prevailed that Lindbergh did not want a scandal and would have gone to any length to make sure this incident would not become public. Lindbergh was once quoted as saying, quote, "The important thing is to start, to lay a plan and then follow it step by step, no matter how small or large each one by itself may seem." End quote. Did Charles Augustus Lindbergh lay a plan to kidnap his son, later murdering him to cover up his true beliefs? Lindbergh was a firm believer in social Darwinism and eugenics, a theory adopted by the Nazis in their quest to eliminate the Jews from the planet. In eugenics, unwanted characteristics are bred out of a race, thereby ensuring the extinction of one race or another. It was common knowledge that little Charlie had to be administered large amounts of vitamin D. His afflictions may have been seen by his father as a defect not in line with Lindbergh's eugenics beliefs. Additionally, Lindbergh sympathized greatly with the Nazis because of those beliefs. In a 1992 interview, the last she gave before her death, Anna Hauptmann, Bruno Richard Hauptmann's wife, appealed to Anne Lindbergh to state the truth about the matter, stating, quote, "I am waiting for the truth to come out. When it does, I will die the next day in peace." End quote. What truth did Anna Hauptmann believe would, quote, come out, end quote, if Anne Lindbergh confessed? On October 2, 1965, Police Superintendent Bob Talbot of the Staley Bridge Police received a call from one of his detectives to appear at the Hyde Police Station and that the matter appeared very urgent. 17-year-old David Smith and his young wife, Maureen, sat in the Hyde Police Station waiting to speak to a ranked member of the force, for the story he had to tell demonstrated such extraordinary facts that the local police constabulary would take a great interest in what Smith had to say. When Superintendent Talbot arrived at the station, a constable led him to the inquiry room where the young couple sat drinking tea. Smith related that the night before, his sister-in-law, Myra, visited his home and stated she was afraid to walk home alone and asked Smith to accompany her to her residence. When the two arrived at Myra's residence in Manchester, Myra invited her brother-in-law into the house, saying that her boyfriend Ian had some wine samples for the youth. After entering the residence, Myra left Smith in the kitchen. According to his statement to Superintendent Talbot, Smith heard silence throughout the house and found himself startled by a loud scream coming from the living room. Myra yelled for Smith to come into the living room. Startled by Myra's scream, Smith moved to the living room and witnessed Myra's boyfriend, Ian, holding what appeared to be a large doll in his arms. Ian dropped the bundle he held in his arms, and when it fell against the couch, Smith saw what he believed to be a young man who groaned incessantly. Smith also witnessed Ian holding an axe, and when the body fell to the floor, Ian smashed the axe into the young man's head. The young man continued to groan. Ian struck the man a second time, and his groaning stopped. The only sound that Smith could hear was the gurgling blood in the victim's throat. Smith then related that Ian placed a cover over the young man's head and wrapped some electrical wire around his neck. Ian pulled on the wire. Each time he gained his composure, he pulled the wire tighter and tighter. Smith stated he repeated, quote, "You f***ing bastard," end quote, over and over again until the man finally stopped breathing. Ian then looked toward Myra and said, quote, "That's the messiest one yet," end quote. After Ian made sure the young man had finally succumbed, he, Myra, and Smith went into the kitchen where she made them all tea. While sitting at the table in a state of shock, Smith claimed that Myra and Ian laughed as they reviewed Ian's kill for the evening and harkened back to a previous murder they allegedly committed together. In one particular instance, a police officer supposedly confronted Myra as the two buried one of their alleged victims on the Saddleworth Moor. Smith then became scared and feared for his safety, not knowing whether the two pulled a sick joke on him while he was there at the house. Smith believed that he could convince Myra and Ian that he was their accomplice. Then, they may not kill him. He helped clean up the mess in the living room, tied up the body, then helped Ian carry it to the upstairs bedroom. Smith stated that he would return in the morning as the hour was late and help them dispose of the body. When Smith returned home, he became physically ill and vomited. After he related the story of the previous night's events to his wife, Maureen, together the young couple went to the public phone box and called the police. Who was this murderous couple? Police learned that Myra Hindley and Ian Brady may have been responsible for a series of missing children in the Manchester area, but wanted to know more of this duo that would later be described as, quote, "two sadistic killers of the utmost depravity," end quote. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, and raised in Gorton, a working-class area of Manchester. Frequently beaten by her alcoholic father and ignored by her enabling mother, Myra and the Hindley family resided in a house so small that she slept in a single bed in the same bedroom as her parents, who slept in a double bed. When Myra's sister, Maureen, was born in 1946, the living arrangements became almost unbearable, and her parents sent her to live with her grandmother when she turned 5. Myra's father was a veteran of World War II who fought in the bloody campaigns of North Africa, Cyprus, and Italy, and expected his children to be just as tough as he. Described as a hard man, one day when Myra was 8, a young boy met her outside her house and scratched her on both cheeks, drawing blood. When the distraught Myra returned home in tears, her father met her at the door and threatened to whip her if she didn't go back and punch the boy who caused her to cry. Myra left the house, found the boy, and through a series of punches accomplished what she described as, quote, "my first victory," end quote. Later evaluations by criminologists determined that this incident demonstrated the brutalization that Myra suffered at the hands of her father and could have contributed to her subsequent murderous behavior. It seemed that Myra suffered nothing but hardship and tragedy within her early life. One of her best friends, Michael Higgins, drowned in an abandoned reservoir. Myra passed up the opportunity to go with her dear friend, but chose instead to go out with another young friend. Myra blamed herself for the tragedy because she was known as a good swimmer, and had she been there with Higgins, he may not have perished. After Higgins' funeral, Myra became heavily involved into the Catholic Church and even took communion in November 1958, much against the wishes of her mother. Also at this time, Myra began dyeing her hair blonde and then started her first job as a junior clerk at a local electrical engineering firm. Well liked and considered an exemplary employee, once when she lost her pay envelope, the other girls in the office started a collection within the firm and replaced the money she lost. Myra also had a love interest at this time, a gentleman named Ronnie Sinclair. Although the two were engaged for a time, Myra broke off the engagement, citing Sinclair's immaturity as the main reason. Myra also began to take judo lessons at a local school, but found partners to work out with sparse as she took the practices too seriously and would not release her grip, hurting her partners. Myra then went to work at Mill Ward's chemical distribution company, and while working there, she met a young man named Ian Brady. She soon became infatuated with the ne'er-do-well petty criminal. She thought the attraction so strong that she began to keep a diary, and although she dated several men, Myra's entries smattered of her longing for Brady. In December of 1961, the 22nd to be exact, Myra accepted an invitation from Brady to go to the cinema to see a movie regarding the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals. The couple continued to see each other and followed a routine on their dates. First, a movie, generally of the X-rated variety. Then the two would go to Myra's residence and drink German wine. They spent their lunch breaks reading from stories of Nazi atrocities. The events so influenced Myra that she began to emulate the Aryan supremacy by continuing to bleach her hair and wear bright red lipstick. This man who exhibited influence over this young, impressionable girl, Ian Brady, was born in Glasgow, Scotland on January 2, 1938, to an unwed mother named Maggie Stewart, who worked as a tea-room waitress. Because Brady's father was an uncertainty to Stewart, he never met the man. Furthermore, because her salary was not enough to take care of her and a young child, Stewart was forced to hand over her young son to a local family with 4 children of their own. Although he lived with another family, Brady's mother still visited him on occasion, but did not know that her young son loved to torture animals in his unstable youth. Brady broke the hind legs of one dog, burned another canine, and cut the head from a neighborhood cat. Throughout his youth, Brady had many brushes with the law. Accepted to an academy for above-average pupils, Brady terrorized children much smaller than himself. The academy expelled the youngster, and Brady then went to work at Harland & Wolff shipyard as a tea-boy. His first girlfriend broke up with him at this time when he threatened her with a knife because she went to a dance with another boy. Brady then had another job where he worked as a butcher's messenger. Police then arrested Brady on burglary twice. Subsequently, Brady appeared in juvenile court on 9 serious charges, never really specified, but the court sentenced the young man to probation on the condition that he lived with his mother, who, by this time, married an Irish fruit merchant by the name of Pat Brady. Ian's stepfather got him a job as a fruit porter at the Smithfield Market. Within 12 months of living with his mother, Brady tried to smuggle some goods from the market, and police arrested him again. Being as he had not reached his 18th birthday, the court sentenced him to a reform school at Hatfield. But after getting drunk on homemade alcohol, authorities transferred Brady to the tougher unit at Hull. On November 14, 1957, Brady returned to Manchester, where he found a series of jobs that he eventually quit. Finally, he announced to his family that he wanted to improve himself and began studying books from the local library on bookkeeping. Brady spent hours in his room where he studied anything he could find related to the study of bookkeeping. In early 1959, Brady applied for a clerical job at Millward's and was hired. After his co-workers met the young man, they remembered him as quiet, always on time for the job, but very short-tempered. What they did notice was the reading material that Brady digested during his breaks and at lunch, books on Nazi atrocities and how to teach yourself German. Little did either Brady or Hinley know that their lives would take a heinous turn. As Hinley and Brady shared their waking moments together, they began to ostracize their co-workers and their families for the sake of each other's company. Hinley changed her appearance even further than her trademark blonde hair. She wore high miniskirts, high-heeled boots, and leather jackets now became parts of her everyday wardrobe. Henley and Brady also took a keen interest in guns and photography. The couple also took photographs of each other in very suggestive and sometimes explicit positions. In 1963, the couple began conversing about committing, quote, the perfect murder, end quote. Brady read the book Compulsion, a fictionalized account of the Leopold and Loeb murder of 14-year-old Bobby Frank. The two rich kids believed themselves above the law and would not face justice, but they made some mistakes on their way to the perfect crime. Instead of the death penalty, their attorney, the incomparable Clarence Darrow, successfully argued for the duo to be sentenced to life in prison so that their minds would be studied to determine their motives for committing the crime. Despite the outcome of the Leopold Loeb case, Brady believed he and Henley would pull it off, or pull them off. In 1963, Brady moved in with Henley at her grandmother's house in Bannock Street. At this time, the two plotted to perfect their plan. Their first victim happened to be a friend of Henley's younger sister, Maureen. Pauline Reed, 16 years old, wanted to go to a dance at the Railway Workers' Social Club on the night she disappeared. Reed planned to attend the dance with 3 of her friends, but when the parents of her friends learned that alcohol would be served at the soiree, they rescinded their permission and the 3 friends did not attend the dance. Reed went to the dance alone that evening. At approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of July 12, 1963, Reed adorned a pretty pink dress and left her home. 2 of the friends who were unable to attend because of their parents' restrictions saw Reed leave her home and decided to follow her to the dance to really see if she would attend the event by herself. The 2 friends followed Reed for some distance and then decided to take a shortcut where they would meet her at the dance. The 2 friends arrived at the Railway Workers' Social Club and waited for over an hour until Reed arrived, but she never showed up at the dance. At approximately midnight of the 12th, Reed's parents became worried when their daughter failed to return from the dance. Joan and Amos Reed, Pauline's parents, decided to go out into the night and look for her themselves, but to no avail. The next morning, they called the police. It seemed that Pauline Reed just vanished. On November 11, 1963, John Kilbride, 12 years old, went to the movies with a friend, John Ryan, also 12, in the afternoon of that day. The film finished at approximately 5 o'clock, and Kilbride and Ryan went to the local market in Ashton-under-Lyne to see if they could earn some money helping the local merchants clean and close their stalls for the day. Ryan later stated that he remembered leaving Kilbride near the carpet dealer's stall so that he could catch his bus home. This was the last time anyone saw Kilbride. When Kilbride failed to return home, his parents, Sheila and Patrick Kilbride, called the local police for the second time in a very short period of time. A search began on the moors surrounding Manchester, with police and thousands of volunteers looking to find the young boy. Their search produced no results whatsoever. On Tuesday, June 16, 1964, Keith Bennett, 12 years old, looked forward to going to his grandmother's house and spending the night as he did every Tuesday evening. In the evening when Keith's mother was to deliver him to his grandmother's house, as became the routine, Keith and his mother walked out of the door of their residence, and Mrs. Bennett watched her son walk over a road crossing and then onto Stockport Road. Mrs. Bennett then turned around and headed to the local bingo game, never worrying that her mother would take care of her son. Keith Bennett never arrived at his grandmother's house, but Mrs. Bennett did not discover that her son was missing until the next morning, when her mother, Winnie, arrived at the Bennett household without the company of little Keith. Immediately, Mrs. Bennett called the local police to report her son missing. Again, a massive search began in the moors near the Bennett residence for Keith Bennett, and again, Keith would not be found either. 6 months passed since Keith Bennett's disappearance. Then, on December 26, 1964, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey disappeared. Leslie and her 2 brothers attended a fair only minutes away from their home. Having spent their money and suffering from boredom, Leslie's friends left, but she remained at the fair. The last time anyone saw Leslie, she stood next to one of the rides at the fair. When she failed to return home, her mother and stepfather frantically searched for Leslie Ann. They called the police and, virtually by habit by now, organized another search of the countryside for their child. They found no trace of her. After David Smith related what happened at the Henley residence the night before, the police, obviously disturbed by what Smith related, went to the house Smith described in order to investigate. When Superintendent Talbot, dressed in a bread deliveryman's uniform, he went to the back door of Henley's residence. When Henley answered the door, Superintendent Talbot asked Henley if her husband was at home. Henley denied that she was married and asked Henley if he could take a look around the house. Talbot found Grady in the living room writing a note to his employer about an injury that occurred the night before. Superintendent Talbot explained to Brady, in front of Henley, that he was investigating a series of reports of shots being fired in the area the night before, and would the couple mind if he took a look around. Joined by a Detective Sergeant Carr, the two began to search the residence. When the two policemen asked Henley for the key to the locked bedroom upstairs, she stated that she often worked in the room. Finally, Brady instructed Henley to hand over the key to the inquisitive lawmen. When they returned to the living room, Superintendent Talbot and Detective Sergeant Carr arrested Brady under suspicion of murder. Brady stated when the police officers arrested him that, quote, "Eddie Evans and I had a row and the situation got out of hand," end quote. Although police only arrested Brady, Henley demanded that she go to the police station with the officers and Brady, bringing her small dog, Puppet, with them. When the police asked her to make a statement, Henley would go no further than to say that Evans's death was an accident. Authorities allowed Henley to return home with the promise that she would return the following morning. Over the subsequent days, Henley went to her employer and asked that she be dismissed so that she may collect unemployment benefits. Henley also tried to destroy any evidence of what the couple had been talking about over the last few years, including but not limited to robbing banks and, the worst thing of all, planning the perfect murder. On October 11, 1965, police arrested Myra Henley as an accessory to the murder of Edward Evans. When police searched the Henley residence where the two had been living, they discovered a, quote, exercise book, end quote, with the name of John Kilbride written on the front cover. Police then suspected that the couple were involved with the disappearances of children that occurred over the previous 2 years, and that Henley's role was much more than just an accomplice. Brady later told police that he and Smith murdered Evans, and Henley merely followed her lover's instructions. Smith stated to police that Brady demanded that Smith pack suitcases with evidence of Brady and Henley's complicity in the disappearances. In one of the suitcases, later discovered at a local train station, authorities located costumes, notes, photographs, and negatives, with some of the photos being that of Leslie Ann Downey, naked and a scarf tied across her mouth, and an audio tape of a girl screaming and pleading for her life. Leslie Ann Downey's mother later identified the desperate girl's voice on the recording as that of her daughter. When police inquired into the happenings at the Henley residence, they came across a 12-year-old boy named Pat Hodges, who inadvertently accompanied Brady and Henley to their many trips to the Saddleworth Moor. Hodges was able to identify several of the sites where the couple took him. Now armed with this new knowledge, police set out to search the moor for clues to where the other children may be. On October 16, 1965, searchers located an arm bone that they mistakenly identified as belonging to John Kilbride. A few days later, Leslie Ann Downey's mother identified the bone as that belonging to her daughter, along with the clothing that police found in the shallow grave. Authorities also located photographs in the aforementioned suitcase that depicted various areas of the Saddleworth Moor. Police asked the local community to identify these areas, as Brady and Henley may have buried the bodies of young children there. Smith related to authorities that Brady kept, quote, photographic evidence, end quote, of multiple murders. On October 21, 1965, authorities discovered the badly decomposed body of John Kilbride, whom his mother identified by the clothing that he wore. On the same day that law enforcement discovered Kilbride's remains, Brady and Henley appeared at Hyde's Magistrate Court charged with the murder of Leslie Ann Downey. Jailers brought the couple to the court to answer the charges separately and then remanded to the jail without bail. They again appeared before the court for a brief 2-minute proceeding, then returned to their cells to await trial. Police believed that Brady and Henley were responsible for the other missing children, but with winter setting in, the search was suspended until such time when they could resume. In a subsequent interrogation, Brady admitted that he took photographs of Leslie Ann Downey, but that 2 men brought the young girl to his residence where the photographs were taken, but then left with the young girl still alive. By December 2, 1965, Brady would face trial for the murders of Evans, Kilbride, and Downey. Henley would face charges in the murders of Evans and Downey, as well as harboring Brady, her knowing that he murdered Kilbride. Authorities used a unique process to identify a timeline with the photographs Brady and Henley took. Most of the photographs included Henley's dog, Puppet, sometimes as a puppy and sometimes full grown. In order to determine this timeline, authorities enlisted a veterinarian to examine the animal for his exact age. The procedure required that the dog be anesthetized. Puppet did not survive the procedure, and Henley expressed fury at the police for killing her puppy. This was the first demonstration of any emotion that the accused murderer Henley exhibited. In a letter to her mother, Henley stated,
"I feel as though my heart's been torn to pieces. I don't think anything could hurt me more than this has."
After preliminary proceedings occurred before the 3 magistrates in Hyde, Brady and Henley's trial began before Mr. Justice Fenton Atkinson on April 19, 1966, at the Chester Assizes. Sir Elwyn Jones led the prosecution. Brady was defended by a Liberal Member of Parliament, Emmeline Hewson, Queen's Counsel, and Henley was defended by Godfrey Heilpern, Queen's Counsel, Recorder of Salford. All of the attorneys within this case were vastly experienced in criminal prosecutions. The chief prosecution witness, David Smith, fielded offers from various media outlets for his story. Smith accepted one of the offers, and the association with the press outlets caused great consternation with the court. Opposing counsels repeatedly questioned both Smith and his wife, Maureen, about the agreement, believing this would have an effect on Smith's testimony to the court. However, Smith's testimony matched the statements he made to the police prior to coming to some agreement with the newspaper concern, without any embellishment whatsoever. So, the issue of Smith selling his story faded away. Brady and Henley both pled not guilty. Brady testified for over 8 hours and Henley for 6. Brady admitted he struck Evans with an axe, but someone else murdered the defendant's former friend when referencing the pathologist's report that Evans's death had been, quote, accelerated by strangulation, end quote. Brady's attitude in front of the jury smattered with, quote, undisguised arrogance and pedantry, end quote. When Henley testified, she stated that none of the photographs taken that the authorities seized were ever taken near any of the grave sites. The audio tape that authorities seized with the voice of Leslie Ann Downey was played in open court. Also, on the recording could be heard the voices of Brady and Henley. Henley admitted in her testimony that she treated Downey in a, quote, brusque and cruel manner, end quote, only because Downey demonstrated a lot of fear and made a lot of noise. Henley claimed to disengagement while Downey undressed, the photos were taken, and eventually Brady murdered the child. On May 6, 1966, the jury in the case against Ian Brady deliberated for a little over 2 hours and found the defendant guilty of all 3 murders, and Henley guilty in the murders of Downey and Evans. While Brady and Henley awaited their trial, Great Britain abolished the death penalty, and so the court sentenced both of them to life imprisonment. The court sentenced Brady to 3 concurrent life sentences, and Henley received 2 concurrent life sentences, with an additional 7 years for harboring Brady for the Kilbride murder. At the close of the proceedings, prosecutors stated that the murders Brady and Henley committed were, quote, truly horrible, end quote, and characterized the 2 convicted defendants as, quote, 2 sadistic killers of the utmost depravity, end quote. 19 years after their initial conviction, newspapers still continued to connect Brady and Henley with other disappearances that occurred during the time of the original disappearances. Brady stated in an interview that he murdered Bennett and Reed, something that the police believed all along, and Bennett and Reed disappeared at about the same time as Kilbride and Downey. After this admission, the Greater Manchester Police reopened the investigation under the command of Detective Chief Superintendent Peter Topping, head of the department's Criminal Investigation Department. When the superintendent went to the prison where Brady resided, the convicted murderer denied committing any further murders. In November of 1986, Keith Bennett's mother wrote an impassioned letter to Henley where she hoped that the convicted murderer would tell her where the sadistic killers buried her son. Winnie Johnson, Keith Bennett's mother, concluded her letter,
I am a simple woman. I work in the kitchens of Christie's Hospital. It has taken me 5 weeks of labor to write this letter because it is so important to me that it is understood by you for what it is, a plea for help. Please, Miss Henley, help me.
Police waited a few days after Henley received the letter and then went to visit her at Cookham Wood, Kent, where she was being held. Henley agreed to identify certain areas where she and Brady visited, but she refused to admit to the murder of any further children. Henley stated that some spots were not identifiable unless she visited them. Against their better judgment, Superintendent Topping went to Home Secretary Douglas Hurd to get special permission for the convicted murderer to visit the moors and possibly find other remains. Secretary Hurd weighed the pros and cons and determined that if this visit to the moors with a convicted killer provided closure to those victims still not confirmed, it would be worth it. On the 16th of December 1986, Henley made the first of 2 visits to the killing grounds of the moors. The visit proved to be a waste of time. David Smith, by this time 38 years old, assisted the police in searching additional areas where remains could possibly be found. On February 10, 1987, Myra Henley confessed to her involvement in all 5 murders, although the information would not be released to the public for 1 month. Superintendent Topping did not fully believe the confession because he said Henley only gave enough information as she wanted the authorities to know. When Superintendent Topping informed Brady of Henley's confession, Brady refused to believe it until authorities gave him some of the details only the killers would know. Brady stated he was ready to confess also, but he wanted the authorities to give him materials for him to commit suicide. Of course, by law, authorities refused this absurd request. Winnie Johnson wrote another letter to Henley, even though she did not respond to the first letter. With all the negative publicity surrounding her first venture to the moors, Johnson pled with Henley again to help find the remains of her son, Keith Bennett. As a result of the plea, Henley visited the moors again and identified 2 locations where Bennett may have been buried, Holland Brown Knoll and Hoe Grain. And although she could not identify the exact spot where the graves may be located, she did recognize a patch of grass on which she sat near where they may have buried Pauline Reed. With Henley's confession and her willingness to help police, cries for her release began to be heard throughout England. On July 1, 1987, authorities found the decomposed body of Pauline Reed 3 feet below the surface and approximately 100 yards from where authorities discovered the remains of John Kilbride. Upon the discovery of Reed's remains, Brady confessed to Superintendent Topping and further stated that he would help police in any further searches. Authorities escorted Brady to the moors for him to identify any grave sites, but he claimed to lose his bearing due to the changes in the landscape since he was last there. When Brady was allowed to go to the moors a second time, he identified a spot where Bennett's body could be found. After digging, the authorities found nothing. Although the 2 convicted murderers admitted to the Reed and Bennett murders, the Director of Public Prosecution saw no further satisfaction could be gained by prosecuting Henley and Brady further. Further attempts to locate Bennett's body in the 21st century failed. Following his conviction, Ian Brady spent 19 years in Durham prison until he was diagnosed as a psychopath and then sent to the high-security Park Lane Hospital, now Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital in Sefton. Brady never cooperated with the staff physicians at the institution, and after he broke his wrist in what he called a fight with staff members, Brady went on a hunger strike where authorities had to force feed him. Brady complained that all he wanted to do is die, and he wasn't even being allowed to do that. Brady finally died on May 15, 2017, from what doctors termed restrictive pulmonary disease at Ashworth Hospital. Myra Hindley filed an appeal to her convictions immediately after the trial. Brady and Hindley corresponded by mail until 1971, when Hindley ended the relationship. Hindley fell in love with one of her prison warders, a Patricia Carnes. This, according to authorities, was not unusual, as most of the warders at the prison where Hindley stood incarcerated were gay and involved in relationships with other women or each other. Hindley successfully changed her status from a Category A prisoner to a Category B prisoner, which allowed her greater freedom in and around the prison. The action caused a national outrage, and the Home Secretary reprimanded the warden of the prison, Governor Dorothy Wing, who stated that this, quote, was part of her unofficial policy of reintroducing her charges to the outside world when she felt they were ready, end quote. After this incident, Hindley, with the help of her lover Carnes and another former inmate on the outside, planned an escape from the prison. An off-duty policeman discovered the plan when he found a set of duplicate keys to the inside doors of the prison. As a result of the plan, the court brought charges, and once found guilty, Hindley received an additional 6 years to her sentence. In 1982, the court determined that Hindley would not be eligible for parole for 25 years. The court then increased this to 30 years until her eligibility could be redeemed. Mrs. Bennett, mother of victim Keith Bennett, held firm in a campaign to keep Hindley in prison until the mother's death in 1999. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher stated in February 1985 that she believed that the sentences for Hindley and Brady were too short, and that, quote, I do not think that either of these prisoners should ever be released from custody, end quote. In July 1990, Hindley stated that she was more involved in the murders for which she stood convicted than she first admitted. Therefore, then Home Secretary David Waddington, quote, imposed a whole life tariff on the inmate, end quote. News of this change reached Hindley in 1994. In 1996, the parole board submitted a recommendation that Hindley be moved to, quote, an open prison, end quote. Hindley rejected this option, but was later moved to a minimum security prison at High Point. Between 1997 and 2000, Hindley protested against her whole life tariff, stating that she was a reformed woman and, quote, no longer a danger to society, end quote. The court rejected each appeal. On November 25, 2002, Hindley died from bronchial pneumonia at West Suffolk Hospital. A heavy smoker, Hindley had been diagnosed with angina in 1999 and hospitalized after suffering a brain aneurysm. Because the effects on the population of the murders and their animus toward Hindley and Brady, 20 undertakers in the area refused to cremate her body. 4 months later, Carnes spread her former lover's ashes in Staley Bridge Country Park. A war hero and contemporary of Joan of Arc, Gilles de Montmorency Laval, later known to history as Gilles de Rais, was born in 1405 into one of the wealthiest families in all of France. By the time Laval had been born, the 100 Years' War had been going on for the last 60 years and would continue for almost 50 more. Gilles' mother and father, Guy de Rais, and mother Marie de Craon, married as a result of an arrangement between their parents to avoid a vendetta of sorts. The de Rais had 2 children, Gilles and his brother René. De Rais became very proficient in academics and the martial doctrine so prevalent with young boys at the time. Several tragedies occurred in Gilles' young life that would characterize his later personality. During the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, de Rais' family suffered a loss when his uncle was slaughtered as a prisoner of war for the English. Later that year, his mother and father died simultaneously, his mother of alleged natural causes and his father in a boar hunting accident. At the age of 14, de Rey was squired out to a local nobleman to learn the ways of being a medieval knight. His grandfather, Jean de Craon, arranged for de Rey to be married relatively early to a girl who was only 4 at the time of the betrothal. Jean de Craon, an always reticent man who saw making his family more rich and powerful, believed the union to be beneficial to him and his family. However, the French Parliament would not allow the marriage to take place due to the fact that the union would bring untold riches to the de Craon family. Instead, Jean de Craon ordered his grandson to kidnap a young lady named Catherine de Tourrat, de Rey's cousin, who was the heir to a large amount of land next to the de Rey estates. Catherine felt compelled to marry de Rey, and the two had one child together, a daughter. This marriage made the de Rey family very wealthy indeed. In English and French history, this time period proved to be the most volatile. Charles VI, King of France, was insane, and his son, also named Charles, ruled France in his stead. Known as the Dauphin, being the heir to the throne, faced a rival claim to the French throne from Henry V, King of England. This claim proved dangerous for the two powers, as this was the main point of contention between the English and French and caused the 100 Years' War. De Rey fought for the Dauphin in these conflicts and distinguished himself very bravely, quote, almost to the point of recklessness, but skilled enough to turn that bravery into victory, end quote. When de Rey turned 25, at the court of the French king, a young lady entered and stated that God sent her to the king in order to defeat his enemies. The young girl asked King Charles VII to give her an army to command, and she would relieve the beleaguered city of Orléans, liberate the city, and deliver the crown to the king. The king knew that if the city fell, he would be defeated. And so, with nothing to lose, Charles VII granted the young girl's request. Joan of Arc stood at the head of a demoralized army, with de Rey as her advisor, and marched to Orléans to meet the English. What started as a doubtful venture, Joan of Arc delivered victory after victory to Charles VII. Because of his successes, the king awarded de Rey with the title of Maréchal de France. Even though de Rey exhibited an overwhelming prowess when it came to military matters, politically he was a novice and clearly outmatched at court. The power of his marshalship was never exerted to its full potential, and in 1431, when the English captured Joan of Arc and held her for ransom, de Rey was powerless to help her. Of course, the English burned her at the stake as a heretic. For the medieval knight, status was everything, and the inability to assist his commander Joan of Arc in her hour of need, de Rey faced another serious blow to his integrity when his maternal grandfather passed away and left his sword and coat of arms to de Rey's younger brother, René. Between 1431 and 1435, the culmination of all these blows to his honor obviously had an effect on de Rey, as about this same time he withdrew from military and public life. This is when historians surmised de Rey began to murder children. The series began when de Rey's cousin, Gilles de Sille, hired a young apprentice to deliver a message. The young boy failed to arrive at his destination with the message, so Gilles de Sille surmised that the young man may have fallen victim to highwaymen. Furthermore, de Rey concerned himself with the building of a chapel where he presided over masses in dressings of his own design. He also dabbled in playwriting and produced a work that almost made him bankrupt. He began selling properties and, at first, people observing the events determined that de Rey may have had an ulterior motive for doing so. De Rey's family became concerned that the knight was spending through the de Craon wealth and appealed to Charles VII to step in and keep de Rey from selling all the land and squandering the money. The king issued an edict that forbid anyone to buy any more property from the knight, nor were any of the subjects to enter into a contract with him. However, de Rey and the family fled to Brittany, where the king's edict had no effect. Once de Rey made it to his destination, he sent out word that he wanted to speak with persons who knew anything about alchemy and demon summoning. Through a local priest, Eustache Blanchet, and François Prelati, de Rey sent the men out to find individuals who had great knowledge of the, quote, dark arts, end quote. When the religious clerics returned, Deray held a plethora of ancient and forbidden knowledge. Armed with this knowledge, Deray began experiments where he attempted to summon a demon named Baron in the main hall of his castle at Tiforges. After several attempts, a demon failed to materialize. Prelati suggested to Deray that Baron appeared to be angry and required that Deray provide the demon with the sacrifice of body parts from children. In a few of the ceremonies, Deray offered these pieces in a glass vessel, but again, to no avail. The demon failed to appear. Frustrated with his failures and almost broke because of this venture, Deray set a course for the weird and tragic. He began murdering young children between 1432 and 1433. But because of the ravages of time, no record of these first homicides exists. However, when Deray later gave a confession as to the murders he did commit, he included the first ones along with his morbid tally. After committing some homicides in Chantoissy-sur-Loire, Deray made his way to Mouchecout. Deray murdered or ordered to be murdered a great number of children after, it has been said, he sodomized them first. Subsequently, 40 naked bodies of children had been discovered in Mouchecout in 1437. One of the first documented cases of child abduction in this case occurred when a 12-year-old boy named Joudon was engaged to deliver a message to Mouchecout and failed to return. No one knew where the young adolescent may have gone to. According to sources regarding Gilles Deray, the method of the many murders had been documented as thus. The boy was pampered and then dressed in better clothes than he had ever known. The evening began with a large meal and heavy drinking, particularly Hippocras, which acted as a stimulant. The boy was then taken to an upper room to which only he and Deray in his immediate circle were admitted. There he was confronted with the true nature of his situation. The shock thus produced on the boy was an initial source of pleasure for Gilles. Deray employed a body servant known as Etienne Corillot, also known as Poitou, who acted as an accomplice to his night master. During Deray's trial, Poitou later testified that Deray stripped the young boys naked, hanged them with ropes from a hook to prevent the victim from crying for help, then, quote, masturbated upon the child's belly or thighs, end quote. Then Deray would cut the child down, provided some short period of comfort, then would kill the child by decapitation, cutting their throats, breaking their necks with a stick, and then dismembering them. According to the manservant, Deray took, quote, infinitely more pleasure in debauching himself in this manner than in using their natural orifice in the normal manner, end quote. After their deaths, Deray later admitted that he kissed them and then cut off the parts of their bodies that he most admired. Deray then sat on their stomachs in the throes of their agony and watched them die. The parts of the bodies remaining were burned in the huge fireplace of the hall, with the clothes of the victims being placed over the body parts to minimize the smell. The ashes were deposited in a myriad of hiding places. On May 15, 1440, Deray kidnapped a local cleric during a dispute with the church of Saint-Étienne de Mer-Morte. Deray drew attention when the Bishop of Nantes decided to investigate the incident, during which time Deray's crimes became exposed. In the latter part of July in that year, the bishop issued his findings, and in September 1440, authorities arrested Deray, Poitou, and another manservant. Deray's case would be tried by both secular and ecclesiastical courts on the charges of murder, sodomy, and heresy. Even after overwhelming evidence given to the court by the eyewitnesses that convinced the judges of Deray's guilt, he confessed his crimes on October 21, 1440. Testimony given was said to be so lurid and grotesque, judges struck it from the record. In the end, historians have ventured to guess that Deray's victims ranged from between 80 and 200, and although his victims included those young people between the ages of 6 and 18, with members of both sexes, most of them were boys. On October 23, 1440, a secular court heard the confessions of Poitou and Henriette, the other manservant, and sentenced them to death. On October 26, 1440, at approximately 9 a.m., guards led Deshayes and the two manservants in a procession to the palace of execution located on the Ile de Biesse. Deshayes requested to be executed first, and that request was granted. First being hanged, the executioners set the platform on fire. Before the flames could consume the body, executioners cut down Deshayes' body, and 4 women came forth to collect it for burial. The two manservants met the same fate, but their bodies were reduced to ashes and then scattered. Court authorities granted Deshayes' final request to be buried on the church of the monastery located at Notre-Dame-des-Carmes in Nantes. After Gilles de Rais's conviction and execution, doubts surfaced as to whether the knight was truly guilty. Immediately after his execution, the prosecutor at the trial received all of Deshayes' lands and wealth, dividing it amongst his own nobles. Additionally, some historians have made the argument that Deshayes' prosecution and death were the result of a conspiracy against the Catholic Church or the French state. Some writers contend that Deshayes was the victim of a French Inquisition. Historians now view Gilles de Rais as a, quote, lapsed Catholic who descended into crime and depravity, end quote. In 1992, a group of scholars, writers, and historians assembled to try Deshayes again, based upon the records available regarding the trial. They found the embattled knight not guilty. However, none of them were medieval historians, nor did the so-called, quote, experts, end quote, turn to medieval historians for any advice. To this day, historians believe Gilles de Rais to be guilty of his crimes and can be classified as a medieval serial killer.
We hope you have enjoyed our third marathon and look for future marathons and new episodes in the future on this channel. Please tell your friends and any other true crime aficionados you may know and let them know about our channel. Some people discover us by accident and aren't really aware that we exist. Also, subscribe and hit the bell so that you will be notified of any uploads which may appear on the channel in the near future, and there's going to be some future episodes. I would like to express our deepest thanks to our subscribers, and we would like to request that you support our channel through Subscribestar, Rumble, and we have a PayPal account. Also, we're on Facebook and Twitter, and I will leave the links below. Until next time.